Part 2, Identities and Isms. Market Anarchism as Stigmergic Socialism. Brad Spangler, 2006. The Wikipedia entry on market anarchism has been ever so slightly bugging me for a while, but I've not been able to lay my finger upon the matter of precisely why until now. Block quote. Market anarchism is a philosophy opposing the state and favoring trade of private property in markets. Market anarchists include mutualists and anarcho-capitalists. Market anarchists include mutualists, such as Proudhon, and some individualist anarchists, such as Tucker, who supported a market economy and a system of possession based upon labor and use. As a result of their adherence to the labor theory of value, they oppose profit. The term market anarchism is also used to describe anarcho-capitalism, a theory which supports a market economy, but unlike mutualism, does not have a labor theory of value. As a result, it has no opposition to profit. Agorism might be considered a branch of anarcho-capitalism or individualist anarchism/mutualism. It might be considered an attempt to reconcile anarcho-capitalism with individualist anarchism and even the rest of libertarian socialism where possible. After thinking about this a great deal, I've come to the conclusion that the above exaggerates the differences between anarcho-capitalism and mutualism as ideologies, but not necessarily as movements, an important distinction to make. As a result, I'd like to review why I believe anarcho-capitalism is in some ways incorrectly named, and why this in turn has resulted in an anarcho-capitalist movement consisting of a large number of deviationists insufficient in their adherence to their own stated principles. Once again, we must explore the various definitions of capitalism and socialism to see why. Why, for instance, is mutualism considered socialism, while the Rothbardian strain of market anarchist thought is capitalism? To understand, let's first examine the anarcho-capitalist movement as a whole. There are two sharply divided strands of thought within anarcho-capitalism based on the stated rationale for a market anarchist society: the natural law, natural rights thought of Murray Rothbard, and the utilitarianism of David Friedman. To understand the differences between the two and why they matter, let's look at Rothbard's Do You Hate the State? Footnote: Murray and Rothbard, Do You Hate the State? Libertarian Forum, 10.7, July 1977, page 1. The essay explains in Rothbard's own words that genuine Rothbardians are motivated by a passion for pure and simple justice. The state and its allies are understood to be a criminal gang, an ongoing system of theft, oppression, slavery, and murder. The thought of the Friedmanites, by contrast, is a mere intellectual discourse upon what would maximize total prosperity in a society. Utilitarianism is an academic exercise suitable for economics textbooks. Such studies are to be welcome to the extent that they make justice, i.e. anarchy, more appealing to the amoral and boost our own confidence in its workability. But to substitute utilitarianism for natural rights theory within anarcho-capitalism is to quite literally sell out ethical principle for a mess of pottage. For whereas the natural rights libertarian seeking morality and justice cleaves militantly to pure principle, the utilitarian only values liberty as an ad hoc expedient, and since expediency can and does shift with the wind, it will become easy for the utilitarian in his cool calculus of cost and benefit to plump for statism in ad hoc case after case, and thus to give principle away. Under a strictly utilitarian view, then, one loses sight of who the enemy is. Those who unfairly benefit from plunder as an aggregate will never willingly give up on it. As an aside, the anarchist FAQ touches on this matter while insufficiently illuminating it. In a criticism of Friedmanite utilitarianism, Rothbard explains the problem of utilitarianism lacking an anti-state theory of property, unlike his own natural law approach. The FAQ offers an out-of-context excerpt from a passage that appears to give the impression that Rothbard was arguing in favor of tyranny, when in fact he was doing the exact opposite, in highlighting the shortcomings of the utilitarian approach. From the FAQ. Even worse, the possibility that private property can result in worse violations of individual freedom, at least of workers, than the state of its citizens, was implicitly acknowledged by Rothbard. He uses as a hypothetical example a country whose king is threatened by a rising libertarian movement. The king responds by employing a cunning stratagem, namely, he proclaims his government to be dissolved, but just before doing so, he arbitrarily parcels out the entire land area of his kingdom to the ownership of himself and his relatives. Rather than taxes, his subjects now pay rent, and he can regulate the lives of all the people who presume to live on his property as he sees fit. Rothbard then asks, now what should be the reply of the libertarian rebels to this pert challenge? If they are consistent utilitarians, they must bow to this subterfuge and resign themselves to living under a regime no less despotic than the one they had been battling for so long. Perhaps indeed more despotic, for now the king and his relatives can claim for themselves the libertarians' very principle of the absolute right of private property, an absoluteness which they might not have dared to claim before. So not only does the property owner have the same monopoly of power over a given area as the state, it is more despotic as it is based on the absolute right of private property. And remember, Rothbard is arguing in favor of anarcho-capitalism. The passage mirrors a passage making the same point in For a New Liberty. Block quote. Let us illustrate with a hypothetical example. Suppose that libertarian agitation and pressure has escalated to such a point that the government and its various branches are ready to abdicate, but they engineer a cunning ruse. Just before the government of New York State abdicates, it passes a law turning over the entire territorial area of New York to become the private property of the Rockefeller family. The Massachusetts legislature does the same for the Kennedy family, and so on for each state. The government could then abdicate and decree the abolition of taxes and coercive legislation, but the victorious libertarians would now be confronted with a dilemma. Do they recognize the new property titles as legitimately private property? The utilitarians, who have no theory of justice in property rights, would, if they were consistent with their acceptance of given property titles as decreed by government, have to accept a new social order in which 50 new satraps would be collecting taxes in the form of unilaterally imposed rent. The point is that only natural rights libertarians, only those libertarians who have a theory of justice in property titles that does not depend on government decree, could be in a position to scoff at the new ruler's claims to have private property in the territory of the country, and to rebuff these claims as invalid. So that part of the anarchist FAQ critique would appear to lead to an inaccurate perception of what Rothbard was arguing for. It applies to Friedman's version of anarcho-capitalism, and Rothbard was the one who first pointed it out, long before the anarchist FAQ was even around. In fact, Rothbard's natural law theory very much laid an alternative foundation for understanding of why the distribution of property under existing capitalism is unjust, because the so-called property of the plutocracy is typically unjustly acquired. Natural law theory and the resulting radically anti-state Rothbardian take on Lockean principles of property can potentially be expanded to offer a framework for the revolutionary anti-state redistribution of property, in that state-granted title to property is often a fraudulent perk of the political class. Block quote. The only genuine refutation of the Marxian case for revolution, then, is that capitalists' property is just rather than unjust, and that therefore its seizure by workers or by anyone else would in itself be unjust and criminal. But this means that we must enter into the question of the justice of property claims, and it means further that we cannot get away with the easy luxury of trying to refute revolutionary claims by arbitrarily placing the mantle of justice upon any and all existing property titles. Such an act will scarcely convince people who believe that they or others are being grievously oppressed and permanently aggressed against. But this also means that we must be prepared to discover cases in the world where violent expropriation of existing property titles will be morally justified, because these titles are themselves unjust and criminal. Refer also to Rothbard's Confiscation and the Homestead Principle. In it, he makes the case for anarcho-syndicalist-style worker takeover of large enterprises that have become mammoth concentrations of capital because of markets being skewed in favor of the corporation by government favoritism. I believe he only retreated from this position because he did not see a clear path to revolution and did not trust the state to redistribute property in an ethical manner. Yet if the matter of who defines the bounds of property rights is handled in a destatized manner, with open registries for property claims that must stand up to popular approval if these claims will be of actual use in resolving disputes in a market anarchist court, i.e. arbitration system, such can and should be an organic component of market anarchist revolutionary strategy of the sort Konkin envisioned. Compare the above with the matter of why mutualism is considered socialism. Mutualism is considered socialism because of its foundation on the labor theory of value. Socialism, however, has never been a mere intellectual discourse upon why the labor theory of value was supposedly a superior line of academic thought. Socialism is not and never has been a club. Socialists have always been motivated by a passion for social justice as best they understand it, which naturally implies that understanding is capable of being raised to a greater degree of accuracy and sophistication. The labor theory of value previously provided the chosen theoretical understanding for why and how the lower classes in society were systematically robbed by the upper classes. That understanding of existing capitalist society as systematic theft, oppression, and speculation about how to achieve a more just society has, I contend, always been the defining quality of all earnest socialists. It is my contention that Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism is misnamed because it is actually a variety of socialism, in that it offers an alternative understanding of existing capitalism, or any other variety of statism, as systematic theft from the lower classes, and envisions a more just society without that oppression. Rather than depending upon the labor theory of value to understand this systematic theft, Rothbardian market anarchism utilizes natural law theory and Lockean principles of property and self-ownership taken to their logical extreme as an alternative framework for understanding and combating oppression. I'll say it, although his cultural roots in the old right would, if he were still alive, admittedly cause him fits to be characterized as such, Murray Rothbard was a visionary socialist. The inconsistencies in Rothbardian thought derive from Rothbard's failure to fully develop libertarian class theory and a theory of revolution, work that was largely completed within the Rothbardian tradition by Konkin. Because the market anarchist society would be one in which the matter of systematic theft had been addressed and rectified, market anarchism, with the exception of Friedmanite utilitarian anarcho-capitalism, is best understood as a new variety of socialism, a Stigmergic socialism. Stigmergy is a fancy word for systems in which a natural order emerges from the individual choices made by the autonomous components of a collective within the sphere of their own self-sovereignty. To the extent coercion skews markets by distorting the decisions of these autonomous components, individual people, it ought to be seen that a truly free market, a completely Stigmergic economic system, necessarily implies anarchy, and that any authentic collectivism is necessarily delineated in its bounds by the natural rights of the individuals composing the collective. In conclusion, lack of adherence to the labor theory of value does not mean Rothbardian market anarchists are not socialist. The labor theory of value served as an attempted illumination of the systematic theft the lower classes have always suffered from under statism. Rothbard's natural law theory and radically anti-state version of Lockean property rights theory serves the same role. I would suggest, as I have before, that no anarchism is capitalist if capitalism is understood as the status quo, and that it is oppressive in an economic sense as a result of the monopolization of capital. Rothbardian market anarchism as a body of theory, particularly as contextually modified by Konkin's theories of revolution and class, answers the social question, i.e., it addresses the problem of capitalism, and is therefore just as much a part of the libertarian socialist tradition as Tuckerite/Proudhonian mutualism. In some ways, it's very nearly the same thing, explained with different rhetoric. Abolition of state-granted privilege? Check. Labor-based ownership rights? Check. Redistribution of property as a result of the above? Check. An unavoidable consequence of the rise of a non-state system of law, not beholden to fake grants of title to politically favored interests. We're socialists. Get over it. In fact, it could even be argued that we're redder, in the sense that having a theory of revolution that Tucker and Proudhon never had makes us a tad more insurrectionary. Anarcho-socialism is a misnomer. Anarchism, all of anarchism, is libertarian socialism. The argument that anarcho-capitalism is not anarchism because it's capitalist is shown to be wrong once capitalism is properly understood as state-driven monopolization of capital. Rothbardian market anarchism is socialism because it meets the most basic and original definition of socialism, attempting to answer the social question. It's actually anti-capitalist and therefore misnamed. Most of what we've come to see as indicators of socialist thought, hostility to markets and true labor-based property rights, pro-state authority, are actually indicative of a subset of socialist thought that gained influence. The labor theory of value was simply the leading edge of economic theory at the time in the 1800s. Now it's subjective value theory and the Austrian school generally. We're still answering the social question. Our answer is simple: free the market. Armies that overlap. Benjamin R. Tucker, 1890. Of late, the 20th century has been doing a good deal in the way of definition. Now, definition is very particular business, and it seems to me that it is not always performed with due care in the 20th century office. Take this, for instance. A socialist is one who believes that each industry should be coordinated for the mutual benefit of all concerned under a government by physical force. It is true that writers of reputation have given definitions of socialism not differing in any essential from the foregoing, among others, General Walker. But it has been elaborately proven in these columns that General Walker is utterly at sea when he talks about either socialism or anarchism. As a matter of fact, this definition is fundamentally faulty and correctly defines only state socialism. An analogous definition in another sphere would be this: religion is belief in the messiahship of Jesus. Supposing this to be a correct definition of the Christian religion, nonetheless it is manifestly incorrect as a definition of religion itself. The fact that Christianity has overshadowed all other forms of religion in this part of the world gives it no right to a monopoly of the religious idea. Similarly, the fact that state socialism during the last decade or two has overshadowed other forms of socialism gives it no right to a monopoly of the socialistic idea. Socialism, as such, implies neither liberty nor authority. The word itself implies nothing more than harmonious relationship. In fact, it is so broad a term that it is difficult of definition. I certainly lay claim to no special authority or competence in the matter. I simply maintain that the word socialism, having been applied for years by common usage and consent as a generic term to various schools of thought and opinion, those who try to define it are bound to seek the common element of all these schools and make it stand for that, and have no business to make it represent the specific nature of any one of them. The 20th century definition will not stand this test at all. Perhaps here is one that satisfies it. Socialism is the belief that progress is mainly to be effected by acting upon man through his environment, rather than through man upon his environment. I fancy that this will be criticized as too general, and I am inclined to accept the criticism. It manifestly includes all who have any title to be called socialists, but possibly it does not exclude all who have no such title. Let us narrow it a little. Socialism is the belief that the next important step in progress is a change in man's environment of an economic character that shall include the abolition of every privilege whereby the holder of wealth acquires an anti-social power to compel tribute. I doubt not that this definition can be much improved, and suggestions looking to that end will be interesting, but it is at least an attempt to cover all the forms of protest against the existing usurious economic system. I have always considered myself a member of the great body of socialists, and I object to being read out of it or defined out of it by General Walker, Mr. Pentecost, or anybody else simply because I am not a follower of Karl Marx. Take now another 20th century definition, that of anarchism. I have not the number of the paper in which it was given, and cannot quote it exactly, but it certainly made belief in cooperation an essential of anarchism. This is as erroneous as the definition of socialism. Cooperation is no more an essential of anarchism than force is of socialism. The fact that the majority of anarchists believe in cooperation is not what makes them anarchists, just as the fact that the majority of socialists believe in force is not what makes them socialists. Socialism is neither for nor against liberty. Anarchism is for liberty, and neither for nor against anything else. Anarchy is the mother of cooperation, yes, just as liberty is the mother of order, but as a matter of definition, liberty is not order, nor is anarchism cooperation. I define anarchism as the belief in the greatest amount of liberty compatible with equality of liberty, or, in other words, as the belief in every liberty except the liberty to invade. It will be observed that, according to the 20th century definitions, socialism excludes anarchists, while, according to liberty's definitions, a socialist may or may not be an anarchist, and an anarchist may or may not be a socialist. Relaxing scientific exactness, it may be said briefly and broadly that socialism is a battle with usury and that anarchism is a battle with authority. The two armies, socialism and anarchism, are neither coextensive nor exclusive, but they overlap. The right wing of one is the left wing of the other. The virtue and superiority of the anarchistic socialist, or socialistic anarchist as he may prefer to call himself, lies in the fact that he fights in the wing that is common to both. Of course, there is a sense in which every anarchist may be said to be a socialist virtually, inasmuch as usury rests on authority, and to destroy the latter is to destroy the former. But it scarcely seems proper to give the name socialist to one who is such unconsciously, neither desiring, intending, nor knowing it. The Individualist and the Communist, a Dialogue. Rosa Slobodinsky and Voltairine de Cleyre, 1891. Our host is engaged and requests that I introduce myself to... I beg your pardon, sir, but I have not the pleasure of meeting the communist speaker who addressed the meeting on Blank Street last evening.
Your face seems familiar to me, too.
Doubtless you may have seen me there, or at some kindred place. I am glad at the opportunity to talk with you, as your speech proved you to be somewhat of a thinker. Perhaps...
Ah, indeed. I recognize you now. You are the apostle of capitalistic anarchism.
Capitalistic anarchism? Yes, if you choose to call it so. Names are indifferent to me. I am not afraid of bugaboos. Let it be so, then. Capitalistic anarchism.
Well, I will listen to you. I don't think your arguments will have much effect, however. With which member of your holy trinity will you begin? Free land, free money, or free competition?
Whichever you prefer.
Then free competition. Why do you make that demand? Isn't competition free now?
No, but one of the three factors in production is free. Laborers are free to compete among themselves, and so are capitalists to a certain extent. But between laborers and capitalists there is no competition whatever, because through governmental privilege granted to capital, whence the volume of the currency and the rate of interest is regulated, the owners of it are enabled to keep the laborers dependent on them for employment, so making the condition of wage subjection perpetual. So long as one man or class of men are able to prevent others from working for themselves because they cannot obtain the means of production or capitalize their own products, so long those others are not free to compete freely with those to whom privilege gives the means. For instance, can you see any competition between the farmer and his hired man? Don't you think he would prefer to work for himself? Why does the farmer employ him? Is it not to make some profit from his labor? And does the hired man give him that profit out of pure good nature? Would he not rather have the full product of his labor at his own disposal?
And what of that? What does that prove?
I am coming to that directly. Now, does this relation between the farmer and his man in any way resemble a cooperative affair between equals, free to compete but choosing to work together for mutual benefit? You know it does not. Can't you see that since the hired man does not willingly resign a large share of his product to his employer, and it is out of human nature to say he does, there must be something which forces him to do it? Can't you see that the necessity of an employer is forced upon him by his lack of ability to command the means of production? He cannot employ himself, therefore he must sell his labor at a disadvantage to him who controls the land and capital. Hence he is not free to compete with his employer any more than a prisoner is free to compete with his jailer for fresh air.
Well, I admit that much. Certainly the employee cannot compete with his employer.
Then you admit that there is not free competition in the present state of society. In other words, you admit that the laboring class are not free to compete with the holders of capital because they have not and cannot get the means of production. Now for your what of that. It follows that if they had access to land and opportunity to capitalize the product of their labor, they would either employ themselves, or if employed by others, their wages or remuneration would rise to the full product of their toil, since no one would work for another for less than he could obtain by working for himself.
But your object is identical with that of communism. Why all this to convince me that the means of production must be taken from the hands of the few and given to all? Communists believe that. It is precisely what we are fighting for.
You misunderstand me if you think we wish to take from or give to anyone. We have no scheme for regulating distribution. We substitute nothing, make no plans. We trust to the unfailing balance of supply and demand. We say that with equal opportunity to produce, the division of product will necessarily approach equitable distribution, but we have no method of enacting such equalization.
But will not some be strong and skillful, others weak and unskillful? Will not one deprive the other because he is more shrewd?
Impossible. Have I not just shown you that the reason one man controls another's manner of living is because he controls the opportunities to produce? He does this through a special governmental privilege. Now, if this privilege is abolished, land becomes free and ability to capitalize products, removing interest, and one man is stronger or shrewder than another, he nevertheless can make no profit from that other's labor because he cannot stop him from employing himself. The cause of subjection is removed.
You call that equality? That one man shall have more than others simply because he is stronger or smarter? Your system is no better than the present. What are we struggling against but that very inequality in people's possessions?
But what is equality? Does equality mean that I shall enjoy what you have produced? By no means. Equality simply means the freedom of every individual to develop all his being, without hindrance from another, be he stronger or weaker.
What? You will have the weak person suffer because he is weak? He may need as much or more than a strong one, but if he is not able to produce it, what becomes of his equality?
I have nothing against your dividing your product with the weaker man if you desire to do so.
There you are with charity again. Communism wants no charity.
I have often marveled on the singularity of communistic mathematics. My act you call charity. Our act is not charity. If one person does a kind act, you stigmatize it. If 1 + 1 summed up and called a commune does the same thing, you laud it. By some species of alchemy akin to the transmutation of metals, the arsenic of charity becomes the gold of justice. Strange calculation. Can you not see that you are running from a bugaboo again? You change the name, but the character of an action is not altered by the number of people participating in it.
But it is not the same action. For me to assist you out of pity is the charity of superior possession to the inferior. But to base society upon the principle, from each according to his capacity, and each according to his needs, is not charity in any sense.
That is a finer discrimination than logic can find any basis for. But suppose that for the present we drop the discussion of charity, which is really a minor point, as a further discussion will show.
But I say it is very important. See, here are 2 workmen. One can make 5 pairs of shoes a day, the other, perhaps, not more than 3. According to you, the less rapid workman will be deprived of the enjoyments of life, or at any rate, will not be able to get as much as the other, because of a natural inability, a thing not his fault, to produce as much as his competitor.
It is true that under our present conditions there are such differences in productive power, but these, to a large extent, would be annihilated by the development of machinery and the ability to use it in the absence of privilege. Today the majority of trade people are working at uncongenial occupations. Why? Because they have neither the chance for finding out for what they are adapted, nor the opportunity of devoting themselves to it if they had. They would starve to death while searching, or finding it would only bear the disappointment of being kept outside the ranks of an already overcrowded pathway of life. Trades are, by force of circumstances, what formerly they were by law, matters of inheritance. I am a tailor because my father was a tailor, and it was easier for him to introduce me to that mode of making a living than any other, although I have no special adaptation for it. But postulating equal chances, that is, free access and non-interest-bearing capital, when a man finds himself unable to make shoes as well or as rapidly as his co-worker, he would speedily seek a more congenial occupation.
And he will be traveling from one trade to another, like a tramp after lodgings.
Oh no, his lodgings will be secure. When you admitted that competition is not now free, did I not say to you that when it becomes so, one of 2 things must happen? Either the laborer will employ himself, or the contractor must pay him the full value of his product? The result would be increased demand for labor. Able to employ himself, the producer will get the full measure of his production, whether working independently, by contract, or cooperatively, since the competition of opportunities, if I may so present it, would destroy the possibility of profits. With the reward of labor raised to its entire result, a higher standard of living will necessarily follow. People will want more in proportion to their intellectual development. With the gratification of desires come new wants, all of which guarantees constant labor demand. Therefore, even your trades tramp will be sure of his existence. But you must consider further that the business of changing trades is no longer the difficult affair it was formerly. Years ago, a mechanic or laborer was expected to serve from 4 to 7 years' apprenticeship. No one was a thorough workman until he knew all the various departments of his trade. Today, the whole system of production is revolutionized. Men become specialists. A shoemaker, for instance, spends his days in sewing one particular seam. The result is great rapidity and proficiency in a comparatively short a pace of time. No great amount of strength or skill is required. The machine furnishes both. Now you will readily see that even supposing an individual changes his vocation half a dozen times, he will not travel very long before he finds that to which he is adapted, and in which he can successfully compete with others.
But admitting this, don't you believe there will always be some who can produce more than their brothers? What is to prevent their obtaining advantages over the less fortunate?
Certainly I do believe there are such differences in ability, but that they will lead to the iniquity you fear, I deny. Suppose A does produce more than B. Does he in any way injure the latter so long as he does not prevent B from applying his own labor to exploit nature with equal facilities as himself, either by self-employment or by contract with others?
Is that what you call right? Will that produce mutual fellowship among human beings? When I see that you are enjoying things which I cannot hope to get, what think you will be my feelings toward you? Shall I not envy and hate you, as the poor do the rich today?
Why, will you hate a man because he has finer eyes or better health than you? Do you want to demolish a person's manuscript because he excels you in penmanship? Would you cut the extra length from Samson's hair and divide it equally among all short-haired people? Will you share a slice from the poet's genius and put it in the common storehouse so everybody can go and take some? If there happen to be a handsome woman in your neighborhood who devotes her smiles to your brother, shall you get angry and insist that they be distributed according to the needs of the commune? The differences in natural ability are not, in freedom, great enough to injure anyone or disturb the social equilibrium. No one man can produce more than 3 others, and even granting that much, you can see that it would never create the chasm which lies between Vanderbilt and the switchman on his tracks.
But in establishing equal justice, communism would prevent even the possibility of injustice.
Is it justice to take from talent to reward incompetency? Is it justice to virtually say that the tool is not to the toiler, nor the product to the producer, but to others? Is it justice to rob toil of incentive? The justice you seek lies not in such injustice where material equality could only be attained at the dead level of mediocrity. As freedom of contract enlarges, the nobler sentiments and sympathies invariably widen. With freedom of access to land and to capital, no glaring inequality in distribution could result. No workman rises far above or sinks much below the average day's labor. Nothing but the power to enslave through controlling opportunity to utilize labor force could ever create such wide differences as we now witness.
Then you hold that your system will practically result in the same equality communism demands. Yet, granting that, it will take 100 years, or 1,000 perhaps, to bring it about. Meanwhile, people are starving. Communism doesn't propose to wait, it proposes to adjust things here and now, to arrange matters more equitably while we are here to see it, and not wait till the sweet impossible sometime of our great-great-grandchildren may see the dawn of. Why can't you join in with us and help us to do something?
Yeah, we hold that comparative equality will obtain, but prearrangement, institution, direction can never bring the desired result, free society. Waiving the point that any arrangement is a blow at progress, it really is an impossible thing to do. Thoughts, like things, grow. You cannot jump from the germ to perfect tree in a moment. No system of society can be instituted today which will apply to the demands of the future, that under freedom will adjust itself. This is the essential difference between communism and cooperation. The one fixes, adjusts, arranges things, and tends to the rigidity which characterizes the cast-off shells of past societies. The other trusts to the unfailing survival of the fittest and the broadening of human sympathies with freedom. The surety that that which is in the line of progress tending toward the industrial ideal will, in a free field, obtain by force of its superior attraction. Now, you must admit, either that there will be under freedom different social arrangements in different societies, some communistic, others quite the reverse, and that competition will necessarily rise between them, leaving 2 results to determine which is the best, or you must crush competition, institute communism, deny freedom, and fly in the face of progress. What the world needs, my friend, is not new methods of instituting things, but abolition of restrictions upon opportunity. A glance at communism. Voltairine de Cleyre, 1893. Cast thy bread upon the waters, find it after many days. 2 years ago, in a little uptown parlor, the home of a Philadelphia weaver, a group of inquirers after truth were wont to assemble bi-weekly for the discussion of communism versus individualism. There were generally present some 15 communists and 5 or 6 individualists. Let it be here admitted that while all were earnestly seeking truth, each side was pretty thoroughly convinced that the other was searching in the wrong direction, and as near as I am able to ascertain, we are all of the same opinion still. However, in the course of a year, some crumbs of the bread floated into sight in the shape of a dialogue presenting the substance of those discussions, which appeared in the 20th century. Footnote: see Voltairine de Cleyre and Rosa Slobodinsky, The Individualist and the Communist, a Dialogue, Chapter 7, pages 92 to 102 in this volume. Many more days again passed, and now a new fragment, in the shape of a criticism of the dialogue of M. Zametkin in The People of July 17, drifts in with the tide. In attempting a brief reply to this criticism, I do not presume to answer for my co-writer, Miss Slobodinsky. Being an individualist of the ex-quoted stamp myself, I am in no wise authorized to speak for the school. That is the advantage I possess over my critic. Individualism, without quotes, may very comfortably be interpreted as a general name for persons bound to agree upon only one thing, which is that they are not bound to agree on anything else. But when one adds communist, one begins to represent a creed common to a good many others, and if one doesn't represent it correctly, one must immediately recant or be excommunicated. I suspect the arguments presented by the imaginary communist, which were really a condensation of those given by 15 actual communists in the discussions before mentioned, would be deemed heretical by Mr. Zametkin, in which case he must take to quotation marks, for it is well known that communism itself has 2 individuals within its folds, known as the state communist and the free communist. Now, my friends, of whom the imaginary communist was a composite, and who will be much surprised to learn on good communistic authority that they are only straw men, belong to the latter variety sometimes called anarchist communists. An anarchist communist is a person who is a man first and a communist afterward. He generally gets into a great many irreconcilable situations at once, believes that property and competition must die, yet admits he has no authority to kill them, contends for equality and in the same breath denies its possibility, hates charity and yet wishes to make society one vast sheltering arms, and in short, very generally rides 2 horses going in opposite directions at the same time. He is not usually amenable to logic, but he has a heart 40 or 50 times too large for 19th century environments, and in my opinion is worth just that many cold logicians who examine society as a naturalist does a beetle, and impale it on their syllogisms in the same manner as the Emperor Domitian impaled flies on a bodkin for his own amusement. Besides, a free communist, when driven into a corner, always holds to freedom first. The state communist, on the other hand, is logical. He believes in authority and says so. He ridicules a freedom for the individual, which he believes inimical to the interests of the majority. He cries, "Down with property and competition," and means it. For the one he prescribes, take it, and for the other, suppress it. That is very frank. Now to the one point of criticism, viz., the ill adjustment of supply to demand in the case of free competition, resulting in a deficiency once in 1,000 cases and overproduction the rest of the time, either of which is bad economy. Communism, I infer, would create a general supervisory board with branch offices everywhere, which should proceed with a general kind of census-taking regarding the demand for every possible product of manufacture, of agriculture, of lumber, of minerals, for every improvement in education, amusement, or religion. Madam, about how many balls do your boys lose annually over the neighbor's fence? How many buttons do your little girls tear off their frocks? Sir, how many bottles of beer do you stow away in your cellar weekly for Sunday use? Miss, do you have a lover? If so, how often do you write him, and how many sheets of paper do you use for each letter? How many gallons of oil do you use in the parlor lamp when you sit up late? This is not intended as personal, but merely to obtain correct statistics upon which to base next year's output of balls, buttons, beer, paper, oil, etc. Mr. Storekeeper, show me your books, that the government may make sure you sell no more than the prescribed quantity. Mr. Gatekeeper, how many people were admitted to the zoological garden last week? 2,000? At the present ratio of increase, the government will supply a new animal in 6 months. Mr. Preacher, your audiences are decreasing. We must inquire into the matter. If the demand is not sufficient, we must abolish you. Just what means would be taken by the commune in case of a natural deficiency, as for instance the partial failure of the West Pennsylvania gas wells, to compel the obstreperous element to yield the prescribed quantity, I can only conjecture. It might officially order an invention to take the place of the required commodity. Failing this, I do not know what plan would be adopted to preserve the equivalence of labor costs in exchange and have everybody satisfied. Omniscience, however, might provide a way. The competitive law is that the price of a shortened commodity goes up. Free competition would prevent artificial shortening, but if nature went into the business, the commodity would certainly exact a premium in exchange, until some substitute had diminished the demand for it. Ah, cries communism, injustice! To whom? The fellows who were robbed in exchange. And you, what will you do? Exchange labor equivalents to the first-comers and let the rest go without? But what then becomes of the equal right of the others, who may have been very anxious to give more in this last case? Where is the injustice? As our critic observes, however, deficiency is not the greatest trouble, especially natural deficiency. The main thing is, we must be licensed, protected, regulated, labeled, taxed, confiscated, spied upon, and generally meddled with in order that correct statistics may be obtained and a quantity prescribed. Or may we trust to the producers to look out for their own interests sufficiently to avoid understocked and overstocked markets? Whether we may expect provision and order from those concerned, or be condemned to accept a governmental bill of fare from those not concerned. For my part, sooner than have a meddlesome bureaucracy sniffing around in my kitchen, my laundry, my dining room, my study, to find out what I eat, what I wear, how my table is set, how many times I wash myself, how many books I have, whether my pictures are moral or immoral, what I waste, etc. ad nauseum, after the manner of ancient Peru and Egypt, I had rather a few thousand cabbages should rot, even if they happened to be my cabbages. It is possible I might learn something from that. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Advocates of freed markets should oppose capitalism. Gary Chartier, 2010. 1. Introduction. Defenders of freed markets have good reason to identify their position as a species of anti-capitalism. Footnote. For freed markets, see William Gillis, The Freed Market, Chapter 1, pages 19 to 20 in this volume. For free market anti-capitalism, see Kevin A. Carson, Mutualist blog, Free Market Anti-Capitalism. No publisher, mutualist.blogspot.com, December 31st, 2009. To explain why, I distinguish 3 potential meanings of capitalism before suggesting that people committed to freed markets should oppose capitalism in my second and third senses. Then, I offer reasons for using capitalism to tag some of the social arrangements to which freed market advocates should object. 2. 3 senses of capitalism. There are at least 3 distinguishable senses of capitalism. Footnote. Compare Charles Johnson, Anarchistas por la Causa, Radgeek People's Daily, no publisher, March 31st, 2005, radgeek.com. Roderick T. Long, Poot Mop Redu, Austro-Athenian Empire, no publisher, June 22, 2009, aaeblog.com. Fred Foldvary, When Will Michael Moore Nail Land Speculators? The Progress Report, no publisher, October 19, 2009, progress.org. Capitalism, in Johnson's third sense, refers to boss-directed labor, while Long's parallel expression, capitalism too, denotes control of the means of production by someone other than the workers, i.e. by capitalist owners. Foldvary's parallel proposal is exploitation of labor by the big owners of capital. I am inclined to think that many of those who employ capitalism in the pejorative sense intend it to encompass the dominance by capitalists of all social institutions and not just workplaces, though they doubtless see societal dominance and workplace dominance as connected. At any rate, supposing that they do may provide a slender justification for distinguishing my typology from the ones offered by Johnson, Long, and Foldvary. For an earlier discussion by a libertarian of the inherently ambiguous character of capitalism, see Clarence B. Carson, Capitalism, Yes and No, The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, 35.2, February 1985, pages 75 to 82, Foundation for Economic Education, thefreemanonline.org. Thanks to Sheldon Richman for bringing this article to my attention. There are at least 3 distinguishable senses of capitalism. Capitalism 1, an economic system that features personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services. Capitalism 2, an economic system that features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government. Capitalism 3, rule of workplaces, society, and if there is one, the state, by capitalists, that is, by a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. Footnote: while Capitalism 2 obtains whenever business and the state are in bed together, under Capitalism 3, business is clearly on top. Capitalism 1 just is a free market. So if anti-capitalism meant opposition to Capitalism 1, free market anti-capitalism would be oxymoronic. But proponents of free market anti-capitalism aren't opposed to Capitalism 1. Instead, they object either to Capitalism 2 or to both Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3. Footnote: it is unclear when capitalism was first employed. The Oxford English Dictionary identifies William Makepeace Thackeray as the earliest user of the term. See The Newcomes, Memoirs of a Most Respectable Family. 2 volumes, London, Bradbury, 1854 to 1855, 275. By contrast, capitalist as a pejorative has an older history, appearing at least as early as 1792 and figuring repeatedly in the work of the free market socialist Thomas Hodgkin. See, for example, Popular Political Economy, 4 lectures delivered at the London Mechanics Institution, London, Tate, 1827, pages 5, 51-2, 120, 121, 126, 138, 171, Greedy Capitalists, 238-240, 243, 245-249, 253-257, 265. The Natural and Artificial Right of Property Contrasted, a series of letters addressed without permission to H. Browham, Esquire, M.P.F.R.S., London, Steele, 1832, pages 15, 44, 53, 54, 67, 87, 97 to 101, 134 to 135, 150, 155, 180. The pejorative use occurs nearly 80 times throughout the 30-odd pages of Hodgkin's Labor Defined Against the Claims of Capital, or The Unproductiveness of Capital Proved, London, Knight, 1825. It is also possible to find capitalist employed in less than flattering ways by another noted classical liberal. See John Taylor, Tyranny Unmasked, Washington, Davis, 1822. Many people seem to employ definitions that combine elements from these distinct senses of capitalism. Both enthusiasts for and critics of capitalism seem too often to mean by the words something like an economic system that features personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services, and therefore, predictably, also rule by capitalists. But there's good reason to challenge the assumption that dominance by a small number of wealthy people is in any sense a likely feature of a freed market. Such dominance, I suggest, is probable only when force and fraud impede economic freedom. 3. Why Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3 are inconsistent with freed market principles. A. Introduction. Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3 are both inconsistent with freed market principles. Capitalism 2 because it involves direct interference with market freedom. Capitalism 3 because it depends on such interference, both past and ongoing, and because it flies in the face of the general commitment to freedom that underlies support for market freedom in particular. B. Capitalism 2 involves direct interference with market freedom. Capitalism 2 is clearly inconsistent with Capitalism 1, and so with the freed market. Under Capitalism 2, Politicians interfere with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services to enrich themselves and their constituents, and big businesses influence politicians in order to foster interference with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges to enrich themselves and their allies. C. Capitalism 3 depends on past and ongoing interference with market freedom. There are three ways in which Capitalism 3 might be understood to be inconsistent with Capitalism 1 and so with a freed market. The first depends on a plausible, even if contestable, view of the operation of markets. Call this view Markets Undermine Privilege, MUP. According to MUP, in a freed market, absent the kinds of privileges afforded the usually well-connected beneficiaries of state power under Capitalism 2, wealth would be widely distributed and large hierarchical businesses would prove inefficient and wouldn't survive. Both because most people don't like working in hierarchical work environments and because flatter, more nimble organizations would be much more viable than large clunky ones without government support for big businesses, most people in a freed market would work as independent contractors or in partnerships or cooperatives. There would be far fewer large businesses. Those that still existed likely wouldn't be as large as today's corporate behemoths, and societal wealth would be widely dispersed among a vast number of small firms. Other kinds of privileges for the politically well-connected that tend to make and keep people poor, think occupational licensure and zoning laws, for instance, would be absent from a freed market. Footnote: for a devastating critique of rules, often supported by politicians beholden to wealthy and well-connected people who expect to benefit from them, that systematically make and keep people poor, see Charles Johnson, Scratching By, How Government Creates Poverty as We Know It. The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, 5710, December 2007, pages 33 to 38, Foundation for Economic Education, thefreemanonline.org. So ordinary people, even ones at the bottom of the economic ladder, would be more likely to enjoy a level of economic security that would make it possible for them to opt out of employment in unpleasant working environments, including big businesses. And because a free society wouldn't feature a government with the supposed right, much less the capacity, to interfere with personal property rights and voluntary exchanges, those who occupy the top of the social ladder in Capitalism 3 wouldn't be able to manipulate politicians to gain and maintain wealth and power in a freed market, so the ownership of the means of production wouldn't be concentrated in a few hands. In addition to ongoing interference with market freedom, MUP suggests that Capitalism 3 would not be possible without past acts of injustice on a grand scale. And there is extensive evidence of massive interference with property rights and market freedom, interference that has led to the impoverishment of huge numbers of people in England, the United States, and elsewhere. Footnote: compare Albert J. Nock, Our Enemy the State, New York, Morrow, 1935. Kevin A. Carson, The Subsidy of History, The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, 58-5, June 2008, pages 33 to 38, Foundation for Economic Education, thefreemanonline.org, Joseph R. Stromberg, The American Land Question, The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, 59-6, July to August 2009, pages 33 to 38, Foundation for Economic Education, thefreemanonline.org. Freed market advocates should thus object to Capitalism 3, because capitalists are able to rule only in virtue of large-scale, state-sanctioned violations of legitimate property rights. D. Support for Capitalism 3 is inconsistent with support for the underlying logic of freedom. Capitalism 3 might also be understood to be inconsistent with Capitalism 1 in light of the underlying logic of support for freed markets. No doubt some people favor personal property rights and voluntary exchanges, Capitalism 1, for their own sake, without trying to integrate support for Capitalism 1 into a broader understanding of human life and social interaction. For others, however, support for Capitalism 1 reflects an underlying principle of respect for personal autonomy and dignity. Those who take this view, advocates of what I'll call comprehensive liberty, CL, want to see people free to develop and flourish as they choose, in accordance with their own preferences, provided they don't aggress against others. Proponents of CL value not just freedom from aggression, but also freedom from the kind of social pressure people can exert because they or others have engaged in or benefited from aggression, as well as freedom from non-aggressive but unreasonable, perhaps petty, arbitrary, social pressure that constrains people's options and their capacities to shape their lives as they like. Valuing different kinds of freedom emphatically isn't the same as approving the same kinds of remedies for assaults on these different kinds of freedom. While most advocates of CL aren't pacifists, they don't want to see arguments settled at gunpoint. They unequivocally oppose aggressive violence, so they don't suppose that petty indignities warrant violent responses. At the same time, though, they recognize that it makes no sense to favor freedom as a general value while treating nonviolent assaults on people's freedom as trivial. Thus, they favor a range of nonviolent responses to such assaults, including public shaming, blacklisting, striking, protesting, withholding voluntary certifications, and boycotting. Footnote: compare Charles Johnson, Libertarianism Through Thick and Thin, Rad Geek People's Daily, no publisher, October 3, 2008, radgeek.com. Carrie Howley, We're All Cultural Libertarians, Reason Foundation, November 2009, reason.com. CL provides, then, a further reason to oppose Capitalism 3. Most people committed to CL find MUP very plausible, and thus will be inclined to think of Capitalism 3 as a product of Capitalism 2. But the understanding of freedom as a multidimensional value that can be subject to assaults both violent and nonviolent provides good reason to oppose Capitalism 3, even if, as is most unlikely, it were to occur in complete isolation from Capitalism 2. Conclusion. Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3 are both inconsistent with freed market principles. Capitalism 2 because it involves direct interference with market freedom, Capitalism 3 because it depends on such interference, both past and ongoing, and because it flies in the face of the general commitment to freedom that underlies support for market freedom in particular. 4. Why freed market advocates should call the system they oppose capitalism. Given the contradictory meanings of capitalism, perhaps sensible people should avoid using it at all. But words are known by the company they keep. Footnote: I became acquainted with this phrase thanks to Nicholas Lash, Believing 3 Ways in One God, a reading of the Apostles' Creed, Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame Press, 1992. See, for example, page 12. But it appears, I have subsequently discovered, to have a legal provenance and to be a rough translation of the Latin phrase nocitur a sociis. So, while they certainly shouldn't use it as a tag for the system they favor, there are good reasons for advocates of freed markets, especially those committed to CL, to use this word for what they oppose. Footnote: to be sure, proponents of freed markets, and so of Capitalism 1, could obviously refer to Capitalism 2 at least as state capitalism, corporate capitalism, actually existing capitalism, or corporatism, but doing so wouldn't make clear their opposition to Capitalism 3. 1. To emphasize the specific undesirability of Capitalism 3. Labels like state capitalism and corporatism capture what is wrong with Capitalism 2, but they don't quite get at the problem with Capitalism 3. Even if, as seems plausible, rule by capitalists requires a political explanation, an explanation in terms of the independent misbehavior of politicians and of the manipulation of politicians by business leaders, it is worth objecting to rule by big business in addition to challenging business-government symbiosis. Footnote: see, for example, Roderick T. Long, Toward a Libertarian Theory of Class, Social Philosophy and Policy, 15-2, Summer 1998. Pages 303 to 349. Tom G. Palmer, Classical Liberalism, Marxism, and the Conflict of Classes, The Classical Liberal Theory of Class Conflict. Realizing Freedom, Libertarian Theory, History, and Practice, Washington, Cato, 2009, pages 255 to 276. Wally Conger, Agorist Class Theory, A Left Libertarian Approach to Class Conflict Analysis. No publisher, no date. Agorism.info. Kevin A. Carson, Another Free for All, Libertarian Class Analysis, Organized Labor, etc. Mutualist blog, Free Market Anti-Capitalism. No publisher, January 26, 2006. Mutualist.blogspot.com. Sheldon, Richman, Class Struggle Rightly Conceived. The Goal is Freedom. Foundation for Economic Education, July 13, 2007. FEE.org. Walter E. Grinder and John Hagel. Toward a Theory of State Capitalism, Ultimate Decision-Making and Class Structure. Journal of Libertarian Studies, 1 1977, pages 59 to 79. To the extent that those who own and lead big businesses are often labeled as capitalists, identifying what proponents of freedom oppose as capitalism helps appropriately to highlight their critique of Capitalism 3. 2. To differentiate proponents of freed markets from vulgar market enthusiasts. The capitalist banner is often waved enthusiastically by people who seem inclined to confuse support for freed markets with support for Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3, perhaps ignoring the reality or the problematic nature of both, perhaps even celebrating Capitalism 3 as appropriate in light of the purportedly admirable characters of business titans. Opposing capitalism helps ensure that advocates of freed markets are not confused with these vulgar proponents of freedom for the power elite. 3. To emphasize that the freed market really is an unknown ideal. Similarly, given the frequency with which the contemporary economic order in Western societies is labeled capitalism, anyone who acknowledges the vast gap between ideals of freedom and an economic reality distorted by privilege and misshapen by past acts of violent dispossession will have good reason to oppose what is commonly called capitalism rather than embracing it. 4. To challenge a conception of the market economy that treats capital as more fundamental than labor. Multiple factors of production, notably including labor, contribute to the operation of a market economy. To refer to such an economy as capitalist is to imply incorrectly that capital plays the most central role in a market economy, and that the capitalist, the absentee owner of investable wealth, is ultimately more important than the people who are the sources of labor. Advocates of freed markets should reject this inaccurate view. Footnote. See Kevin A. Carson, Capitalism, a Good Word for a Bad Thing. Center for a Stateless Society. Center for a Stateless Society, March 6, 2010. See number 4ss.org. 5. To reclaim socialism for freed market radicals. Capitalism and socialism are characteristically seen as forming an oppositional pair, but it was precisely the socialist label that a radical proponent of freed markets, Benjamin Tucker, owned at the time when these terms were being passionately debated and defined. Footnote. See Benjamin R. Tucker, State Socialism and Anarchism, How Far They Agree and Wherein They Differ, instead of a book by a man too busy to write one, New York, Tucker, 1897, fair-use.org, no date. Compare Kevin A. Carson, Socialist Definitional Free-for-All, Part 2, Mutualist Blog, Free Market Anti-Capitalism, no publisher, December 8, 2005, mutualist.blogspot.com. Brad Spangler, Restating the Point, Rothbardian Socialism, bradspangler.com, no publisher, October 10, 2009. Gary Chartier, Socialist Ends, Market Means, 5 Essays, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa Alliance of the Libertarian Left, 2009, Center for a Stateless Society, August 31, 2009. See number 4ss.org. Tucker clearly saw no conflict between his intense commitment to freed markets and his membership of the First International. That's because he understood socialism as a matter of liberating workers from oppression by aristocrats and business executives, and he, plausibly, believed that ending the privileges conferred on economic elites by the state would be the most effective and safest way of achieving socialism's liberating goal. Opposing capitalism helps to underscore the important place of radicals like Tucker in the contemporary freedom movement's lineage, and to provide today's advocates of freedom with a persuasive rationale for capturing the socialist label from state socialists. This is especially appropriate because advocates of freedom believe that society, connected people cooperating freely and voluntarily rather than the state, should be seen as the source of solutions to human problems. Thus, they can reasonably be said to favor socialism, not as a kind of, but as an alternative to, stateism. Footnote. Thanks to Sheldon Richman for helping me to see this point. Embracing anti-capitalism underscores the fact that freed markets offer a way of achieving socialist goals, fostering the empowerment of workers and the wide dispersion of ownership of and control over the means of production using market means. Footnote: Alex Tabarrok, Rename Capitalism Socialism, Marginal Revolution, No Publisher, January 25, 2010, marginalrevolution.com, maintains, capitalism is a truly social system, a system that unites the world in cooperation, peace, and trade. Thus, if all were tabula rasa, socialism might be a good name for capitalism, but that boat has sailed. It seems to me that Tabarrok misses the point of the argument about capitalism, which is precisely whether what is regularly labeled capitalism by the majority of people in the world really is a truly social system that unites the world in cooperation, peace, and trade. 6. To express solidarity with workers. If MUP is correct, the ability of big business, capital, to maximize the satisfaction of its preferences more fully than workers are able to maximize the satisfaction of theirs is a function of business-state symbiosis that is inconsistent with freed market principles. And as a matter of support for CL, there is often further reason to side with workers when they are being pushed around, even non-aggressively. To the extent that the bosses workers oppose are often called capitalists, so that anti-capitalism seems like a natural tag for their opposition to these bosses, and to the extent that freed markets, by contrast with Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3, would dramatically increase the opportunities for workers simultaneously to shape the contours of their own lives and to experience significantly greater prosperity and economic security, embracing anti-capitalism is a way of clearly signaling solidarity with workers. Footnote: compare Sheldon Richman, Workers of the World Unite for a Free Market. The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, Foundation for Economic Education, December 18, 2009, thefreemanonline.org. 7. To identify with the legitimate concerns of the global anti-capitalist movement. Owning anti-capitalism is also a way, more broadly, of identifying with ordinary people around the world who express their opposition to imperialism, the increasing power in their lives of multinational corporations, and their own growing economic vulnerability by naming their enemy as capitalism. Perhaps some of them endorse inaccurate theoretical accounts of their circumstances in accordance with which it really is a freed market system, Capitalism 1, that should be understood as lying behind what they oppose. But for many of them, objecting to capitalism doesn't really mean opposing freed markets. It means using a convenient label provided by social critics who are prepared, as advocates of freedom too often regrettably are not, to stand with them in challenging the forces that seem bent on misshaping their lives and those of others. Advocates of freedom have a golden opportunity to build common ground with these people, agreeing with them about the wrongness of many of the circumstances they confront, while providing a freedom-based explanation of their circumstances and remedy for the attendant problems. Footnote: quote, "If you were to ask what is anarchism, we would all disagree," said Vlad Blefet, a member of the collective that organized the 2010 Los Angeles Anarchist Book Fair. While most anarchists agree on the basic principle that the world would be better without hierarchy and without capitalism, he said, they have competing theories on how to achieve that change. Kate Linthicum, Book Fair draws an array of anarchists. LATimes.com. Los Angeles Times, January 25, 2010. Given the focus on opposition to real-world hierarchy, I suspect, without evidence, that Blifett's primary objection was not to capitalism as a system of ownership and exchange in the abstract, Capitalism 1, but rather to social dominance by capitalists, Capitalism 3. The failure to see this point will tend to impede an otherwise natural alliance focused on issues ranging from war to torture to surveillance to drugs to freedom of speech to corporatism to bailouts to decentralization to the reach of the administrative state. 5. Conclusion. 35 years ago, Karl Hess wrote, "I have lost my faith in capitalism, and I reject this capitalist nation-state," observing that he had turned from the religion of capitalism. Footnote: Karl Hess, Dear America, New York, Morrow, 1975, pages 3 and 5. Even more bluntly, Hess writes, "What I have learned about corporate capitalism, roughly, is that it is an act of theft, by and large, through which a very few live very high off the work, invention, and creativity of very many others. It is the grand larceny of our particular time in history, the grand larceny in which a future of freedom, which could have followed the collapse of feudalism, was stolen from under our noses by a new bunch of bosses doing the same old things." Page 1. Complicating the story is the fact that Hess subsequently wrote Capitalism for Kids, Growing Up to Be Your Own Boss, Wilmington, Delaware, Enterprise, 1987. Distinguishing three senses of capitalism, market order, business-government partnership, and rule by capitalists, helps to make clear why, like Hess, someone might be consistently committed to freedom while voicing passionate opposition to something called capitalism. It makes sense for freed market advocates to oppose both interference with market freedom by politicians and business leaders and the social dominance, aggressive and otherwise, of business leaders. And it makes sense for them to name what they oppose capitalism. Doing so calls attention to the freedom movement's radical roots, emphasizes the value of understanding society as an alternative to the state, highlights the difference between freed market ideal and present reality, underscores the fact that proponents of freedom object to non-aggressive as well as aggressive restraints on liberty, ensures that advocates of freedom aren't confused with people who use market rhetoric to prop up an unjust status quo, and expresses solidarity between defenders of freed markets and workers, as well as ordinary people around the world who use capitalism as a shorthand label for the world system that constrains their freedom and stunts their lives. Freed market advocates should embrace anti-capitalism in order to encapsulate and highlight their full-blown commitment to freedom and their rejection of alternatives that use talk of liberty to conceal acquiescence in exclusion, subordination, and deprivation. Footnote: Brian Doherty, Ayn Rand, Radical for Something Other Than Capitalism? Hit and Run, Reason Magazine, Reason Foundation, January 20th, 2010, Reason.com. Reports: I have been happy using capitalism in Rand's ideal sense as that which American libertarians advocate, which I think is true and I don't think represents such a severe intellectual, marketing, or historical problem as Long says. Doherty opines that Long is far too blithe in his conclusion that the fact that Western prosperity can be attributed to the extent that it has honored property rights, free exchange, and a price system deserves only the intellectual status of that part of our culture that is not diseased. I am not clear what it means to say that Rand's ideal sense is true, in what way are definitions or senses true, and I am inclined to suspect that a cluster of praxeological, moral, and historical claims provides credible support for the left libertarian critique of capitalism and for the diagnosis of much of the economic order that obtains in the contemporary West as diseased. This most emphatically does not amount to a positive assessment of actually existing alternatives. Anarchism Without Hyphens. Karl Hess, 1980. There is only one kind of anarchist. Not two, just one. An anarchist, the only kind as defined by the long tradition and literature of the position itself, is a person in opposition to authority imposed through the hierarchical power of the state. The only expansion of this that seems to me reasonable to say is that an anarchist stands in opposition to any imposed authority. An anarchist is a voluntarist. Now, beyond that, anarchists also are people, and as such contain the billion-faceted varieties of human reference. Some are anarchists who march voluntarily to the cross of Christ. Some are anarchists who flock voluntarily to the communes of beloved inspirational father figures. Some are anarchists who seek to establish the syndics of voluntary industrial production. Some are anarchists who voluntarily seek to establish the rural production of the kibbutzim. Some are anarchists who voluntarily seek to disestablish everything, including their own association with other people, the hermits. Some are anarchists who will deal voluntarily only in gold, will never cooperate, and swirl their capes. Some are anarchists who voluntarily worship the sun and its energy, build domes, eat only vegetables, and play the dulcimer. Some are anarchists who worship the power of algorithms, play strange games, and infiltrate strange temples. Some are anarchists who see only the stars. Some are anarchists who see only the mud. They spring from a single seed, no matter the flowering of their ideas. The seed is liberty, and that is all it is. It is not a socialist seed. It is not a capitalist seed. It is not a mystical seed. It is not a determinist seed. It is simply a statement. We can be free. After that, it's all choice and chance. Anarchism, liberty, does not tell you a thing about how free people will behave or what arrangements they will make. It simply says the people have the capacity to make the arrangements. Anarchism is not normative. It does not say how to be free. It says only that freedom, liberty, can exist. Recently, in a libertarian journal, I read the statement that libertarianism is an ideological movement. It may well be. In a concept of freedom, it, they, you, or we, anyone, has the liberty to engage in ideology or anything else that does not coerce others, denying their liberty. But anarchism is not an ideological movement. It is an ideological statement. It says that all people have a capacity for liberty. It says that all anarchists want liberty, and then it is silent. After the pause of that silence, anarchists then mount the stages of their own communities and history and proclaim their, not anarchism's, ideologies. They say how they as anarchists, will make arrangements, describe events, celebrate life, work. Anarchism is the hammer idea, smashing the chains. Liberty is what results, and in liberty, everything else is up to people and their ideologies. It is not up to the ideology. Anarchism says, in effect, there is no such uppercase dominating ideology. It says that people who live in liberty make their own histories and their own deals with and within it. A person who describes a world in which everyone must or should behave in a single way, marching to a single drummer, is simply not an anarchist. A person who says that they prefer this way, even wishing that all would prefer that way, but who then says that all must decide, may certainly be an anarchist. Probably is. Liberty is liberty. Anarchism is anarchism. Neither is Swiss cheese or anything else. They are not property. They are not copyrighted. They are old, available ideas, part of human culture. They may be hyphenated, but they are not, in fact, hyphenated. They exist on their own. People add hyphens and supplemental ideologies. Liberty, finally, is not a box into which people are to be forced. Liberty is a space in which people may live. It does not tell you how they will live. It says eternally only that we can. What Laissez-Faire? Sheldon Richman, 2010. Writing in The Guardian last January under the headline Caribbean Communism versus Capitalism, respected journalist Stephen Kinzer began his article like this. Visiting unhappy Cuba is especially thought-provoking for anyone familiar with its unhappy neighbors. Cubans live difficult lives and have much to complain about. So do Jamaicans, Dominicans, Haitians, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, and others in the Caribbean basin who live under capitalist governments. Who is worse off? Does an ordinary person live better in Cuba or in a nearby capitalist country? Footnote: Stephen Kinzer, Caribbean Communism versus Capitalism. The Guardian, Guardian News and Media, January 22, 2010. Guardian.co.uk. Many people would read this without pause, but presumably not libertarians. Are Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador capitalist countries? Kinzer's matter-of-fact statement seems to conflict with other evidence. For example, the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, which overstates countries' degree of economic freedom, rates the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, El Salvador, and Guatemala moderately free, and not free or mostly free, and Honduras and Haiti mostly unfree. So how can they be capitalist unless capitalism and freedom are two different things? One may infer from Kinzer's article that he classifies any country capitalist as long as Marxist socialism is not its official ideology. So he states, comparing the two political and social systems also reminds us that for many people in the world, a truly fulfilling life is unattainable. The best hope for longtime communist Cuba and its longtime capitalist neighbors would be to learn from each other. My purpose here is not to focus on Kinzer's curiously positive statements about Cuba and its social safety net, but rather on his use of the word capitalist. He apparently regards that designation so uncontroversial that he feels no need to justify it or even to define the term. Kinzer, however, is not an anomaly. Consider Richard Posner's book about the recent financial debacle, A Failure of Capitalism. Posner is no left-leaning journalist. He's a federal judge with a long association with the University of Chicago and the market-oriented law and economics movement. Yet here he is blaming capitalism for the current economic troubles and, as a result, embracing Keynesianism. He writes in his preface, "We are learning from it, the Depression, that we need a more active and intelligent government to keep our model of a capitalist economy from running off the rails. The movement to deregulate the financial industry went too far by exaggerating the resilience, the self-healing powers, of laissez-faire capitalism." Posner is hardly a lone wolf on his side of the political spectrum. Tune in to the financial programs on the Fox News Channel and Fox Business Network any day, and you'll hear Lawrence Kudlow, Ben Stein, or any number of other economic conservatives warning that Barack Obama's policies threaten to undermine our capitalist system. That certainly implies that there is today a capitalist system to undermine. What is capitalism? What then is this system called capitalism? It can't be the free market because we have no free market. Today, the hand of government is all over the economy, from money and banking to transportation to manufacturing to agriculture to insurance to basic research to world trade. If the meaning of a concept consists in how it is used, there's no Platonic form to be divined, capitalism can't mean the free market. Rather, it designates a system in which the means of production are de jure privately owned. Left open is the question of government intervention. Thus, the phrases free market capitalism and laissez-faire capitalism are typically not seen as redundant, and the phrases state capitalism or crony capitalism are not seen as contradictions. If without controversy capitalism can take the qualifiers free market and state, that tells us something. This is true regardless of what dictionaries say. From at least the time of Samuel Johnson, lexicographers have understood dictionaries to be descriptive, not prescriptive. New editions routinely modify definitions in light of current usage. This is not just a semantic point. One wonders about the value of spending time arguing whether what we have is really capitalism or not, and it is more than a matter of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, important as that is. It is a matter of historical understanding. For although Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand tried mightily to have capitalism understood as the free market, they were swimming upstream. As historian Clarence Carson wrote in The Freeman in the 1980s, capitalism does not have a commonly accepted meaning, proponents of it to the contrary notwithstanding. As matters stand, it cannot be used with precision in discourse. Carson wondered why one would call a system in which production and exchange are carried on privately capitalism. So far as I can make out, he wrote, there is no compelling reason to do so. There is nothing indicated in such arrangements that suggests why capital among the elements of production should be singled out for emphasis. Why not land? Why not labor? Or indeed, why should any of the elements be singled out? There are other curious features of the word. When an ism is added to a word, it denotes a system of belief, and probably what has come to be called an ideology, Carson writes. But a capitalist is not one who advocates capitalism in the way that a socialist is one who advocates socialism. He is rather one who owns capital. A capitalist can be a socialist without contradiction. It is also useful to bear in mind that the word was not initially embraced by free market advocates. That was apparently a 20th century phenomenon. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word capitalist came first and was used pejoratively in the late 18th century. Of course, Marx used it and related words as condemnation, but it was not only opponents of private property who used the words that way. Most notably, Thomas Hodgkin, 1787 to 1868, a free market liberal and Herbert Spencer's mentor, preceded Marx in this usage. By capitalist, he meant one who controlled capital and exploited labor as a result of state privilege, in violation of the free market. A short history of capitalism. As important as economic theory is to understanding history, it is no substitute for history. Knowing how free markets work cannot in itself tell us that the free market existed in any given historical period. Mises and Rand notwithstanding, from early on historical capitalism has been associated with government intervention on behalf of landowners and factory owners. Capitalism, of course, is linked to the Industrial Revolution, which began in England, but the rise of industrialism in England followed massive expropriations of yeomen from lands they had struggled to acquire de facto rights over for generations. As another Carson, Kevin Carson, wrote in The Freeman, "In the Old World, especially Britain, the expropriation of the peasant majority by a politically dominant landed oligarchy took place over several centuries in the late medieval and early modern period. It began with the enclosure of the open fields in the late Middle Ages. Under the Tudors, church fiefdoms, especially monastic lands, were expropriated by the state and distributed among the landed aristocracy. The new owners evicted or rack-rented the peasants. The process continued with land reforms and parliamentary enclosures into the 19th century, turning tillers of the soil, those who mixed their labor with the land, into tenants. Commons were privatized by the state, that is, given to the privileged, at the expense of people who previously had long-standing customary rights in them. Independent subsistence farmers and artisans were left no choice but to farm for someone else or to work in the new factories, with some of their income skimmed off by landlords and employers. The proletariat was born, as F.A. Hayek acknowledges. By libertarian standards, that constitutes exploitation because state power lay behind the workers' plight. The opportunity to work in the factories is often presented as a blessing, but it looks less benign when the land theft is recognized. Further, there is evidence that the new factory owners obtained some of their capital from old money interests, but even if that were not so, the industrialists benefited from the state's interference with the yeoman's land rights. Members of the ruling class and observers frequently expressed concern that no one would choose to work for someone else in an unpleasant factory if he could work for himself on the land or as an artisan. They shared the view of the early 19th century British writer E.G. Wakefield, where land is cheap and all men are free, where everyone who so pleases can obtain a piece of land for himself. Not only is labor very dear, as respects the laborer's share of the product, but the difficulty is to obtain combined labor at any price. In no way did laissez-faire begin at this point. Kevin Carson writes, "In addition, factory employers depended on harsh authoritarian measures by the government to keep labor under control and reduce its bargaining power. In England, the laws of settlement, decried by Adam Smith, acted as a sort of internal passport system, preventing workers from traveling outside the parish of their birth without government permission. Thus, workers were prevented from voting with their feet in search of better-paying jobs. The combination laws, which prevented workers from freely associating to bargain with employers, were enforced entirely by administrative law without any protections of common law due process. Thus, the interventionist state tainted the emergence of the industrial age. It would have emerged spontaneously otherwise. As Albert J. Nock wrote, "The horrors of England's industrial life in the last 19th century furnish a standing brief for addicts of positive intervention. Child labor and woman labor in the mills and mines, Coketown and Mr. Bounderby, starvation wages, killing hours, vile and hazardous conditions of labor, coffin ships officered by ruffians, all these are glibly charged off by reformers and publicists to a regime of rugged individualism, unrestrained competition, and laissez-faire. This is an absurdity on its face, for no such regime ever existed in England. They were due to the state's primary intervention, whereby the population of England was expropriated from the land, due to the state's removal of land from competition with industry for labor." Thus, as Kevin Carson writes, "Capitalism, arising as a new class society directly from the old class society of the Middle Ages, was founded on an act of robbery as massive as the earlier feudal conquest of the land. From the outset of the Industrial Revolution, what is nostalgically called laissez-faire was in fact a system of continuing state intervention to subsidize accumulation, guarantee privilege, and maintain work discipline. The taint of government intervention into economic activity carried over to the British North American colonies. The radical nature of the American Revolution has masked the class struggle within American colonial society between what historian Merrill Jensen called radicals and conservatives in his book, The Articles of Confederation, an Interpretation of the Social Constitutional History of the American Revolution, 1774 to 1781. Class analysis was not originated by Marx, but by the earlier laissez-faire radicals Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer. A privileged, politically connected elite came to dominate each colony, living off big land grants and taxes. Power and land were handed out as royal favors, and the wealthy recipients became entrenched. In the North, the ruling class consisted of merchants, in the South of the big planters. Jensen notes that in Pennsylvania, for example, the merchants had tried by various means to overthrow the system of markets and auctions in order to get a monopoly of the retail trade. Then, as now, established business preferred cartels to free and unpredictable competition. The elites came to think of themselves as the wise aristocracy destined to govern, and they were not eager to give up power when the radicals first started to push for independence from Britain. Staying in the empire was seen as the key to holding local political power. The radicals and the conservatives thus had different economic and political interests and different views about independence from Great Britain. When British usurpations made continued association with the empire intolerable, even for many conservatives, those groups then disagreed over how the new nation should be governed. The mercantile interests tended to favor nationalist centralization, which was seen as the best way to maintain their power and restrict the radical Democrats. They hoped to emulate the British mercantilist system. In contrast, the mass of people who felt themselves imposed upon by those interests tended to favor decentralization because they believed they had a better chance for justice and property with local self-government. Thus, what Jensen calls the internal revolution, the effort to break the hold of the elites in the colonies, was at least as important as the external one against the British. The Constitution. Given this pre-independence picture, it should come as no surprise that independent America was no bastion of laissez-faire libertarianism. Indeed, the effort to overthrow the Articles of Confederation, with its weak central quasi-government that lacked the power to tax the people directly or regulate trade, and establish a far stronger central government under the U.S. Constitution, was a continuation of the internal struggle that had occurred before the Revolution. To give just one indication here, it is erroneously believed that the driving force behind the Constitution was the determination to create a free trade zone among the states. Thus, according to the standard account, the Commerce Clause was the response to widespread trade barriers between the states. But several problems present themselves. First, the United States were already a free trade zone, with the exception of rare restrictions on European goods passing from one state to another. Second, in arguing for ratification of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton complained that tariffs were too low, not too high. It is therefore evident that one national government would be able, at much less expense, to extend the duties on imports beyond comparison further than would be practicable to the states separately or to any partial confederacies. Hitherto, I believe it may safely be asserted that these duties have not upon an average exceeded in any state 3%. There seems to be nothing to hinder their being increased in this country to at least treble their present amount. Federalist 12, emphasis added. In other words, competition among the states was keeping tariffs down, while uniting the states under a strong central government would curb that competition cartel style and permit higher tariffs. Indeed, the first economic act of the new Congress in 1789, on July 4th, was a comprehensive protective tariff ranging from 5 to 10%. It was called the Second Declaration of Independence. Third, historian Calvin Johnson notes, in the original debates over adoption of the Constitution, regulation of commerce was used almost exclusively as a cover of words for specific mercantilist proposals related to deep-water shipping and foreign trade. The Constitution was written before Adam Smith, laissez-faire, and free trade came to dominate economic thinking, and the Commerce Clause draws its original meaning from the preceding mercantilist tradition. Barriers on interstate commerce, however, were not a notable issue in the original debates. Emphasis added. Thomas Jefferson's philosophy of decentralization might have been the philosophy of the people, but powerful elites throughout the new states were in Hamilton's camp. As a result, government intervention in critical parts of the economy, internal improvements, and later subsidies to railroads was prominent. When Jefferson and later Jeffersonians gained power, they were able to reverse some of the damage, but the nationalism and statism of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay were always in the wings waiting for a Lincoln to be elected. Distributing land. A revealing story is to be found in the disposition of federal lands. As noted, political favoritism and land speculation, yielding fortunes, were scandalous in the colonial period. Things changed little after the Revolution. Despite the impression given by the Homestead Act of 1862, most land, and certainly the best land, was given or sold on sweetheart terms to influential economic interests, most prominently but not exclusively the railroad interests. Needless to say, the landless and powerless were not among the buyers. As historian Paul Wallace Gates wrote in 1935, "The Homestead Law did not completely change our land system. Its adoption merely superimposed upon the old land system a principle out of harmony with it. It will appear that the Homestead Law did not end the auction system or cash sales as is generally assumed, that speculation and land monopolization continued after its adoption as widely perhaps as before, and within as well as without the law, that actual homesteading was generally confined to the less desirable lands distant from railroad lines, and that farm tenancy developed in frontier communities in many instances as a result of the monopolization of the land. The large landholdings produced by this policy, parts of which were kept idle, limited the opportunities of those without power and influence, increasing their dependence on employers and landlords. The situation thus bears some resemblance to that in England. Aside from the land issue, we know from the work of Jonathan R.T. Hughes and others that from the beginning, government entwinement in the economies of the colonies and states was common. Hughes wrote in The Governmental Habit Redu, "The relevant history extends back to the New Deal. A few go back further into the late 19th century, but in fact, the powerful and continuous habit of non-market control in our economy reaches back for centuries." Thus, during the colonial period, virtually every aspect of economic life was subject to non-market controls. Some of this tradition would not survive, some would become even more powerful, while some would ascend to the level of federal control. The colonial background was like an institutional gene pool. Most of the colonial institutions and practices live on today in some form, and there is very little in the way of non-market control that does not have a colonial or English forerunner. American history did not begin in 1776. The expansion of capitalism. Reviewing a couple of dozen studies of state and local economic intervention in the 19th century, historian Robert Lively concluded in 1955, King Laissez-Faire, then, was according to these reports not only dead, the hallowed report of his reign had all been a mistake. The error was one of monumental proportions, a mixture of overlooked data, interested distortion, and persistent preconception. The substantial energies of government were employed more often for help than for hindrance to enterprise. The broad and well-documented theme reviewed here is that of public support for business development. In the second half of the 19th century, America moved further from, not closer to, laissez-faire, thanks to Lincoln's adoption of Henry Clay's statist American system, which included a national bank, internal improvements, tariffs, and for a while an income tax. As Joseph R. Stromberg writes, in truth, the Gilded Age witnessed a great barbecue, to use Vernon Louis Parrington's phrase, rooted in the rampant statism of the war years, whose participants defended themselves with Spencerian rhetoric while grasping with both hands. The 20th century only accelerated this process by shifting it further to the national level. Big business's complicity in the progressive era reforms is well documented, thanks to Gabriel Kolko and others. If you count favors for major businesses as government intervention, then there was no laissez-faire in the 20th century, even during the Harding-Coolidge years. Herbert Hoover's interventionist record is well known, and it ought to be understood that big business supported Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932 and his administration during its initial period. The corporatist National Recovery Administration was much to its liking and for some didn't go far enough. If one believes that in the throes of the Depression, America might have embraced explicit nationalization of the means of production, then one can conclude that Roosevelt did indeed save capitalism, but not in the sense of the free market, which had already been compromised virtually beyond recognition. The upshot is that historical capitalism was not the free market. Rather, it was an anti-competitive, pro-business system of controls and subsidies in which government and mercantile interests worked together in a misguided attempt to produce economic growth and to promote the fortunes of specific, well-connected interests. As in any period, there are rent-seekers and obliging rulers, with a revolving door between the two groups. But it is important to note that there was no attempt at comprehensive economic planning. Thus, there was scope for entrepreneurship, which needs little encouragement to flourish. By historical standards, the burden of government was light. Grass sprouts through the cracks in the sidewalk. A little economic freedom goes a long way. This historical account is relevant to understanding the basis from which the U.S. economy evolved and to realizing that the trajectory of development has been different from what it would have been had a real free market existed. Privilege has had long-lasting effects, which we still feel today owing to what Kevin Carson calls the subsidy of history. Thus, those who call today's system capitalism cannot be said to be misusing the term. Advocates of the real free market, therefore, would be well advised to avoid using it to describe their preferred social system. Libertarianism Through Thick and Thin. Charles W. Johnson, 2008. To what extent should libertarians concern themselves with social commitments, practices, projects, or movements that seek social outcomes beyond or other than the standard libertarian commitment to expanding the scope of freedom from government coercion? Clearly, a consistent and principled libertarian cannot support efforts or beliefs that are contrary to libertarian principles, such as efforts to engineer social outcomes by means of government intervention. But if coercive laws have been taken off the table, what should libertarians say about other religious, philosophical, social, or cultural commitments that pursue their ends through non-coercive means, such as targeted moral agitation, mass education, artistic or literary propaganda, charity, mutual aid, public praise, ridicule, social ostracism, targeted boycotts, social investing, slowdowns and strikes in a particular shop, general strikes, or other forms of solidarity and coordinated action? Which social movements should they oppose, which should they support, and towards which should they counsel indifference? And how do we tell the difference? Recently, this question has often arisen in the context of debates over whether or not libertarianism should be integrated into a broader commitment to some of the social concerns traditionally associated with the anti-authoritarian left, such as feminism, anti-racism, gay liberation, counterculturalism, labor organizing, mutual aid, and environmentalism. Chris Shabara has called for a dialectical libertarianism, which recognizes that, just as relations of power operate through ethical, psychological, cultural, political, and economic dimensions, so too the struggle for freedom and individualism depends upon a certain constellation of moral, psychological, and cultural factors, and in which the struggle for liberty is integrated into a comprehensive struggle for human liberation, incorporating, among other things, a commitment to gay liberation and opposition to racism. Footnote: Chris Matthew Shabara, Total Freedom, Toward a Dialectical Libertarianism. University Park, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania State University Press, 2000, page 383. Kevin Carson has criticized the vulgar libertarianism of apologists for capitalism who seem to have trouble remembering from one moment to the next whether they're defending actually existing capitalism or free market principles, and has argued that free market anarchists should ally themselves with those radical industrial unions, such as the IWW, that reject the interventionist methods of the state labor bureaucracy. Footnote: Kevin A. Carson, Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, Charleston, South Carolina, Book Surge, 2008, page 142. Radical libertarians, including Carol Moore, Roderick Long, and myself, have suggested that radical libertarian insights naturally complement and should be integrated with an anti-statist form of radical feminism. On the other hand, Jan Narveson has argued that left libertarian concerns about the importance of cultural and social arrangements are at the most a strategic issue which libertarians should consider a separate issue from the structure of our theory. Leonard Read, the indefatigable founder of FEE, famously promoted the argument that libertarianism is compatible with anything that's peaceful, and Walter Block has criticized left-wing libertarians for perverting libertarianism in their effort to integrate common leftist concerns into the libertarian project. Footnote: Walter Block, Libertarianism is unique. It belongs neither to the right nor the left. A critique of the views of Long, Holcomb, and Baden on the left, Hoppe, Fesser, and Paul on the right. Ludwig von Mises Institute. Ludwig von Mises Institute 2006. Mises.org. Page 28. So long as cultural values are expressed without indulging in government intervention or any other form of coercion, Block argues, it should not matter to plumb-line libertarians whether the cultural values in question are left-wing, right-wing, or something else. Give me a break. This issue has nothing to do with libertarianism. No, these are all matters of taste, and de gustibus non est disputandum. Footnote: Block, page 29. However, it is important to keep in mind that the issue at hand in these discussions goes beyond the debate over left libertarianism specifically. The debate leads to some strange bedfellows. Not only left libertarians defend the claim that libertarianism should be integrated into a comprehensive critique of prevailing social relations, so do paleo-libertarians, such as Gary North or Hans Hermann Hoppe, when they make the equal but opposite claim that efforts to build a flourishing free society should be integrated with a rock-ribbed, inegalitarian cultural and religious traditionalism. As do Randian objectivists when they argue that political freedom can only arise from a culture of secular, romantic individualism and an intellectual milieu grounded in widespread, fairly specific agreement with the tenets of objectivist metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. Abstracting from the numerous, often mutually exclusive details of specific cultural projects that have been recommended or condemned in the name of libertarianism, the question of general principle has to do with whether libertarianism should be seen as a thin commitment which can be happily joined to absolutely any non-coercive set of values and projects, or whether it should instead be seen as one strand among others in a thick bundle of intertwined social commitments. These disputes are often intimately connected with other disputes concerning the specifics of libertarian rights theory or class analysis and the mechanisms of social power. In order to get a better grip on what's at stake, it will be necessary to make the question more precise and to tease out the distinctions between some of the different possible relationships between libertarianism and thicker bundles of social, cultural, religious, or philosophical commitments, which might recommend integrating the two on some level or another. Thickness in entailment and conjunction. Let's start with the clearest and least interesting cases. There are clearly cases in which certain social, cultural, religious, or philosophical commitments might just be an application of libertarian principles to some specific case, which follow from the non-aggression principle by virtue of the law of non-contradiction. An Aztec libertarian might very well say, of course libertarianism needs to be integrated with a stance on particular religious doctrines. It means you have to give up human sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli. Or, to take a politically current debate, it might well be argued that libertarians ought to actively oppose certain traditional cultural practices that involve the systematic use of violence against peaceful people, such as East African customs of forcing clitoridectomy on unwilling girls, or the American and European custom of excusing or justifying a man's murder of an unfaithful wife or her lover. Although not allowed for by government laws, revenge murders were until very recently often acquitted or given a lesser sentence by judges and juries. What's going on in these cases is that consistent, principled libertarianism logically entails criticism of these social and cultural practices for the same reason that it entails criticism of government intervention, because the non-aggression principle condemns any violence against individual rights to life, liberty, and property, regardless of who commits them. Thus, we might call this level of integration thickness in entailment. Thickness in entailment does raise one important issue. It is vital for libertarians to recognize that the non-aggression principle commits them to political opposition to any form of systematic coercion, not just the forms that are officially practiced by the government. Thus, principled libertarianism is politically committed not only to anti-statism, but also to opposition to private forms of systematic coercion, such as chattel slavery or domestic violence against women. But in the end, it is dubious how far thickness in entailment really counts as a form of thickness at all, since at bottom it amounts only to the claim that libertarians really ought to be committed to libertarianism all the time. At the opposite extreme, we might consider the extent to which there are social or cultural commitments that libertarians ought to adopt because they are worth adopting for their own sakes, independent of libertarian considerations. For example, it may be worthwhile for libertarians to all be kind to their children, because, among other things, being kind to your children is a worthwhile thing to do in its own right. You might call this thickness in conjunction, since the only relationship it asserts between libertarianism and some other social commitment, here kindness to children, is that you ought to accept the one, for whatever reason, and also, as it happens, you ought to accept the other, for reasons that are independent of libertarianism. But again, it is unclear how far this counts as an interesting form of thickness for libertarianism to demand. If libertarianism is true, then we all ought to be libertarians, and besides being libertarians, we all ought to be good people too. True that, but it's hardly an interesting conclusion, and it's not clear who would deny it. Certainly not those who generally advocate the thin libertarian line. Thickness in entailment and thickness in conjunction tell us little interesting about the relationship between libertarianism and other social commitments, but they do show the extent to which our original question needs to be asked in terms more precise than those in which it is usually asked. Considerations of entailment make clear that consistent libertarianism means not a narrow concern with government intervention only, but also opposition to all forms of coercion against peaceful people, whether carried out within or outside of the official policy of the state. And considerations of conjunction make clear that what is really of interest is not whether libertarians should also oppose social or cultural evils other than those involved in coercion, no doubt they should, but more specifically, whether there are any other evils that libertarians should oppose as libertarians, that is, whether there are any further commitments that libertarians should make beyond principled non-aggression, at least in part because of their commitment to libertarianism. In the two cases we have considered, the logical relationship between libertarian principles and the further commitments is either so tight, logical entailment, or else so loose, mere conjunction, that either the commitments cease to be further commitments, or else they become commitments that are completely independent of libertarianism. Thin conception advocates like Bloch and Narveson often argue as if these two dubious forms of thickness were the only sorts of relationships that are on offer, and if they are right, then it seems unlikely that there is anything very interesting to say about thick libertarianism. But I will argue that, in between the tightest possible connection and the loosest possible connection, there are at least 4 other interesting connections that might exist between libertarianism and further social or cultural commitments. To the extent that they allow for connections looser than entailment but tighter than mere conjunction, they offer a number of important but subtly distinct avenues for thick libertarian analysis and criticism. Thickness for application. One of the most important but most easily overlooked forms of thickness is what I call thickness for application. There might be some commitments that a libertarian can reject without formally contradicting the non-aggression principle, but which she cannot reject without in fact interfering with its proper application. Principles beyond libertarianism alone may be necessary for determining where my rights end and yours begin, or stripping away conceptual blinders that prevent certain violations of liberty from being recognized as such. Consider the way in which garden-variety political collectivism prevents many non-libertarians from even recognizing taxation or legislation by a democratic government as being forms of coercion in the first place. After all, didn't we consent to it? Or, perhaps more controversially, think of the feminist criticism of the traditional division between the private and the political sphere, and of those who divide the spheres in such a way that pervasive, systemic violence and coercion within families turn out to be justified or excused or simply ignored as something private and therefore less than a serious form of violent oppression. To the extent that feminists are right about the way in which sexist political theories protect or excuse systematic violence against women, there is an important sense in which libertarians, because they are libertarians, should also be feminists. Importantly, the commitments that libertarians need to have here aren't just applications of general libertarian principle to a special case. The argument calls in resources other than the non-aggression principle to determine just where and how the principle is properly applied. In that sense, the thickness called for is thicker than entailment thickness, but the cash value of the thick commitments is still the direct contribution they make toward full and complete application of the non-aggression principle. Thickness from grounds. A second logical relationship that might hold between libertarianism and some further commitment is what I call thickness from grounds. Libertarians have many different ideas about the theoretical foundation for the non-aggression principle, that is to say, about the best reasons for being a libertarian. But whatever general foundational beliefs a given libertarian has, those beliefs may have some logical implications other than libertarianism alone. Thus, there may be cases in which certain beliefs or commitments could be rejected without contradicting the non-aggression principle per se, but could not be rejected without logically undermining or contradicting the deeper reasons that justify the non-aggression principle. Although you could consistently accept libertarianism without accepting these commitments or beliefs, you could not do so reasonably. Rejecting the commitments means rejecting the proper grounds for libertarianism. Consider the conceptual reasons that libertarians have to oppose authoritarianism, not only as enforced by governments, but also as expressed in culture, business, the family, and civil society. Social systems of status and authority include not only exercises of coercive power by the government, but also a knot of ideas, practices, and institutions based on deference to traditionally constituted authority. In politics, these patterns of deference show up most clearly in the honorary titles, submissive etiquette, and unquestioning obedience traditionally expected by, and willingly extended to, heads of state, judges, police, and other visible representatives of government, law, and order. Although these rituals and habits of obedience exist against the backdrop of statist coercion and intimidation, they are also often practiced voluntarily. Similar kinds of deference are often demanded from workers by bosses or from children by parents or teachers. Submission to traditionally constituted authorities is reinforced not only through violence and threats, but also through art, humor, sermons, written history, journalism, child-rearing, and so on. Although political coercion is the most distinctive expression of political inequality, you could, in principle, have a consistent authoritarian social order without any use of force. Even in a completely free society, everyone could, in principle, still voluntarily agree to bow and scrape and speak only when spoken to in the presence of the mutually agreed-upon town chief, or unthinkingly agree to obey whatever restrictions and regulations he tells them to follow over their own business or personal lives, or agree to give him as much in voluntary taxes on their income or property as he might ask. So long as the expectation of submission and the demands for wealth to be rendered were backed up only by means of verbal harangues, cultural glorifications of the wise and virtuous authorities, social ostracism of unruly dissenters, and so on, these demands would violate no one's individual rights to liberty or property. But while there's nothing logically inconsistent about a libertarian envisioning or even championing this sort of social order, it would certainly be weird. Yes, in a free society, the meek could voluntarily agree to bow and scrape, and the proud could angrily but non-violently demand obsequious forms of address and immediate obedience to their commands. But why should they? Non-coercive authoritarianism may be consistent with libertarian principles, but it is hard to reasonably reconcile the two. Whatever reasons you may have for rejecting the arrogant claims of power-hungry politicians and bureaucrats, say, for example, the Jeffersonian notion that all men and women are born equal in political authority, and that no one has a natural right to rule or dominate other people's affairs, probably serve just as well for reasons to reject other kinds of authoritarian pretension, even if they are not expressed by means of coercive government action. While no one should be forced as a matter of policy to treat her fellows with the respect due to equals, or to cultivate independent thinking and contempt for the arrogance of power, libertarians certainly can, and should, criticize those who do not, and exhort our fellows not to rely on authoritarian social institutions for much the same reasons that we have to endorse libertarianism in the first place. Strategic thickness, the causes of liberty. There may be also cases in which certain ideas, practices, or projects are entailed by neither the non-aggression principle nor the best reasons for it, and are not logically necessary for its correct application either, but are causal preconditions for implementing the non-aggression principle in the real world. Although rejecting these ideas, practices, or projects would be logically compatible with libertarianism, their success might be important or even causally necessary for libertarianism to get much purchase in an existing statist society, or for a future free society to emerge from statism without widespread poverty or social conflict, or for a future free society to sustain itself against aggressive statist neighbors, the threat of civil war, or an internal collapse back into statism. To the extent that other ideas, practices, or projects are causal preconditions for a flourishing free society, libertarians have strategic reasons to endorse them, even if they are conceptually independent of libertarian principles. Thus, for example, left libertarians, such as Roderick Long, have argued that libertarians have genuine reasons to be concerned about large inequalities of wealth, or large numbers of people living in absolute poverty, and to support voluntary associations, such as mutual aid societies and voluntary charity, that tend to undermine inequalities and to ameliorate the effects of poverty. The reasoning for this conclusion is not that libertarians should concern themselves with voluntary anti-poverty measures because free market principles logically entail support for some particular socio-economic outcome, clearly they do not, nor is it merely because charity and widespread material well-being are worth pursuing for their own sake. They may be, but that would reduce the argument to thickness in conjunction. Rather, the point is that there may be a significant causal relationship between economic outcomes and the material prospects for sustaining a free society. Even a totally free society in which large numbers of people are desperately poor is likely to be in great danger of collapsing into civil war. Even a totally free society in which a small class of tycoons own the overwhelming majority of the wealth, and the vast majority of the population own almost nothing, is unlikely to remain free for long, if the tycoons should decide to use their wealth to purchase coercive legal privileges against the unpropertied majority, simply because they have a lot of resources to attack with, and the majority haven't got the material resources to defend themselves. Now, to the extent that persistent, severe poverty and large-scale inequalities of wealth are almost always the result of government intervention, and thus as much a concern for thickness from consequences, as discussed below, as for strategic thickness, it's unlikely that many totally free societies would face such dire situations. Over time, many if not most of these problems would likely sort themselves out spontaneously through free market processes, even without conscious anti-poverty activism. But even where problems of poverty or economic inequality would sort themselves out in a society that has already been free for some time, they are still likely to be extremely pressing for societies like ours, which are not currently free, which libertarians hope to help become free through education and activism. Certainly, in our unfree market, there are large-scale inequalities of wealth and widespread poverty, most of it created by the heavy hand of government intervention in the form of direct subsidies and the creation of rigged or captive markets. Those tycoons who now enjoy the fruits of those privileges can and have and will continue to exercise some of the tremendous advantage that they enjoy in material resources and political pull to pressure government to perpetuate or expand the interventions from which the profiteering class benefits. Since libertarians aim to abolish those interventions, it may well make good strategic sense for them to oppose and to support voluntary, non-governmental efforts that work to undermine or bypass the consolidated economic power that the government-privileged robber barons currently command. Otherwise, we will find ourselves trying to fight with slingshots while our enemies haul out bazookas. Or, to take a less controversial example, many, if not most, libertarians throughout the history of the movement have argued that there are good reasons for libertarians to promote a culture in which reason and independent thinking are highly valued, and blind conformism is treated with contempt. But if this is a good thing for liberty, it must be for reasons other than some kind of entailment of the non-aggression principle. Certainly everyone has a right to believe things simply because everybody believes it, or to do things simply because everybody does it, as long as their conformism respects the equal rights of independent thinkers to think independently and act independently with their own person and property. It is logically conceivable that a society could be rigidly conformist while remaining entirely free. It would just have to be the case that the individual people within that society were, by and large, psychologically and culturally inclined to be so docile and so sensitive to social disapproval, ostracism, and verbal peer pressure that they all voluntarily chose to go along with the crowd. But again, while it is logically possible for people in such a society to be convinced to respect individual liberty, it's hardly likely to happen, or if it does happen, it's unlikely that things will stay that way for very long. If libertarians have good reasons to believe that reason and independent thinking are good for liberty, it is because in today's unfree society, where the vast majority of people around you are statists, it takes quite a bit of critical thinking and resistance to peer pressure in order to come to libertarian conclusions. And similarly, in a free society, it's likely that a healthy respect for critical thinking and contempt for conformism would be necessary in order to successfully resist later attempts to reinstitute collectivism or other forms of statist coercion. While the non-aggression principle doesn't entail any particular attitude towards socioeconomic equality or independent thinking, it is quite likely that any chance of implementing the non-aggression principle in the real world will be profoundly affected by whether these material or intellectual preconditions have been met, and so principled libertarians have good strategic reasons to promote them and to adopt forms of activism that tend to support them through non-statist, voluntary means. Thickness from consequences, the effects of liberty. Finally, there may be social practices or outcomes that libertarians should in some sense be committed to opposing, even though they are not themselves coercive, because 1. Background acts of government coercion are a causal precondition for them to be carried out or sustained over time, and 2. There are independent reasons for regarding them as social evils. If aggression is morally illegitimate, then libertarians are entitled not only to condemn it, but also to condemn the destructive results that flow from it, even if those results are, in some important sense, external to the actual coercion. Thus, for example, left libertarians such as Kevin Carson and Matt McKenzie have argued forcefully for libertarian criticism of certain business practices, such as low-wage sweatshop labor, as exploitative. Throughout the 20th century, most libertarians have rushed to the defense of such practices on the grounds that they result from market processes, that such arrangements are often the best economic options for extremely poor people in developing countries, and that the state socialist solution of expansive government regulation of wages and conditions would distort the market, violate the rights of the workers and bosses to freely negotiate the terms of labor, and harm the very workers that the regulators professed to help. But the problem is that these analyses often attempt to justify or excuse prevailing business practices by appeal to free market principles, when those very practices arose in actually existing markets, which are very far from being free. In Carson's and Mackenzie's view, while the 20th century libertarians were right to criticize state socialist claims that existing modes of production should be even further distorted by expanded government regimentation, too many 20th century libertarians confused that genuine insight with the delusion that existing modes of production would be the natural outcome of an undistorted market. Against these confusions, they have revived an argument drawn from the tradition of 19th century individualist anarchists like Benjamin Tucker, who argued that prevailing government privileges for bosses and capitalists, monopoly, regulatory cartelization of banking, manipulation of the currency, legal restrictions and military violence against union strikers, politicized distribution of land to connected speculators and developers, etc., distorted markets in such a way as to systematically push workers into precarious and impoverishing economic arrangements, and to force them, against the backdrop of the unfree market in land and capital, to make ends meet by entering a free job market on the boss's terms. On Tucker's view, as on Carson's and Mackenzie's, this sort of systematic concentration of wealth and market power can only persist as long as the government continues to intervene in the market so as to sustain it. Free market competition would free workers to better their own lives outside of traditional corporate channels, and would allow entrepreneurs to tear down top-heavy corporate behemoths through vigorous competition for land, labor, and capital. Thus, to the extent that sweatshop conditions and starvation wages are sustained, and alternative arrangements like workers' co-ops are suppressed because of the dramatic restrictions on property rights throughout the developing world, restrictions exploited by opportunistic corporations, which also collaborate with authoritarian governments and pro-government paramilitaries in maintaining or expanding legal privilege, land grabs, and oppressive local order, libertarians, as libertarians, have good reasons to condemn the social evils that arise from these labor practices. Though they could in principle arise in a free market, the actual market they arose in is profoundly unfree, and there is every reason to believe that in a truly free market, the conditions of ordinary laborers, even those who are very poor, would be quite different and much better. Certainly, this offers no reason for libertarians to support the state socialist solution of giving even more power to progressive government in an ill-conceived attempt to correct for the predations that plutocratic government already enabled. But it is a good reason for libertarians to support voluntary, state-free forms of solidarity, such as private fair trade certification, wildcat unionism, or mutual aid societies that work to undermine exploitative practices and build a new society within the shell of the old. Onward. I should make it clear, if it is not yet clear, that my aim in this essay has been to raise some questions, provoke some discussion, and offer some categories for carrying on that discussion intelligently. I've not attempted to answer all of the questions I've raised, or to provide a fully detailed elaboration of thick conceptions of libertarianism, and I've deliberately left a lot of questions open for further discussion. Two of them are worth mentioning in particular in order to avoid possible confusion. First, pointing out that conscientious libertarians may have good reason, as libertarians, to favor other social projects in addition to libertarianism raises a related but importantly distinct question, whether libertarians should favor a gradualist or an immediatist stance toward the abolition of statist controls while those other social projects remain incomplete or frustrated in their progress. In particular, if getting or keeping a flourishing free society depends on having a base of certain social or intellectual preconditions in place, should libertarians make direct efforts to abolish all statist controls immediately and completely, regardless of the social or cultural situation? Or should they hold off until the groundwork is in place and restrict themselves to calls for limited and moderated repeals in the meantime? For much of his career, Murray Rothbard endorsed a form of thin libertarian anarchism, arguing that libertarianism will get nowhere until we realize that there is and can be no libertarian culture. Footnote: Murray N. Rothbard, Left Opportunism, The Case of SLS. Libertarian Vanguard, February to March 1981, page 11. At the same time, he endorsed ultra-immediatism, joking that if he had a magic button that immediately abolished an aspect of the state, he'd break his finger pushing it. In Total Freedom, Chris Scibarra criticizes Rothbard's thin libertarianism as unanchored utopianism. Scibarra argues that a dialectical sensibility recommends a more comprehensive three-level model of social transformation, incorporating not only to the political structure of the state, but the interlocking dynamics by which political structure, level 3, affects and is affected by individual psychology and philosophy, level 1, and the framework of established cultural institutions, level 2. Footnote: Scibarra, page 202. Scibarra's critique of Rothbardianism and his later writing on foreign policy have emphasized the dangers of directly pursuing libertarian policies in contexts where libertarian individualism and anti-authoritarianism are not well established in the local culture. All this strongly suggests that Shibara prefers a form of libertarian gradualism and suspects that any form of immediatism depends on non-dialectical disregard for the cultural base necessary to sustain liberty. But whether Shibara's right about that or wrong about that, you need to keep in mind that endorsing a form of strategic thickness does not, just by itself, commit you to gradualism. That's a separate issue that needs a separate argument. Believing in particular material or cultural preconditions for the flourishing or long-term survival of a free society once statist interventions are repealed does not entail any particular position on whether those invasions ought to continue until that base is established. A dialectical sensibility requires us to consider the possibility that individual attitudes and cultural institutions might adjust dynamically as the political structure changes, and that these changes might be favorable rather than hostile to the cultural base that we advocate, or they may not. Illiberal attitudes may be intransigent, and even without statism, they may nevertheless find new, equally destructive expressions. They may even worsen. The point awaits further investigation and is not settled simply by accepting a thick conception over a thin conception of libertarianism. But even if you concede that immediate repeal of statist controls without the preconditions in place would eventually result in disaster rather than cultural adaptation, that still doesn't settle the argument in favor of gradualism. To do that, you would need to add some kind of further moral argument that would show that people are entitled to continue invading the rights of other people in order to maintain a particular standard of living or to stave off aggression that would otherwise be committed by some unrelated third party at some point in the future. I happen to think that the kind of arguments that you'd need to add to thick libertarianism in order to justify gradualism are morally indefensible. Fortunately, since they are separable from strategic thickness itself, there is no reason why advocates of strategic thickness need to adopt them. That's an important debate and one worth having, but it's worth having elsewhere since it's independent of the debate over thickness. Second, it should be clear that I have not attempted to provide detailed justifications for the specific claims that I made on behalf of particular thick commitments. For example, the claims that libertarians have strong reasons to oppose sexism or to support state-free efforts at mutual aid and labor solidarity. To explain the different forms of thickness, I drew most of my examples from the left libertarian literature, and I happen to think that there are good arguments to be made on that literature's behalf. But for the purposes of this essay, these claims are intended as particular illustrations of underlying concepts, not as proofs of a detailed left libertarian analysis. For all I have said here, it might still be true that further argument would reveal reasons of thickness in application, or from grounds, or in strategy, or from consequences, that support a form of libertarianism quite different from that which I advocate, such as orthodox subjectivism, or even support a form that is almost exactly the opposite, such as Hoppian paleo-libertarianism. Consider the reasons that objectivists give for going beyond laissez-faire principles alone and culturally glorifying big business specifically. It's basically thickness from grounds, Randian egoism, and strategic thickness, in the belief that vilifying big business provides grist for the altruist statist mill. Or consider the reasons that Hoppe offers for ostracizing homosexuals and condemning large-scale migration of unskilled laborers. It's basically thickness from consequences, on the belief that without statist intervention against restrictive uses of property rights, these lifestyle choices would not be sustainable in the face of opposition from civil society. I, as a left libertarian, find these specific appeals specious, or in Hoppe's case, grotesque. But that means only that I disagree with the specific premises, not with the general forms of argument that all thick forms of libertarianism help themselves to. Just which actual social and cultural projects libertarians, as libertarians, should incorporate into theory and practice still needs to be hashed out in a detailed debate over specifics, but I hope that here I have at least cleared some of the ground that must be cleared for that debate to sensibly proceed. Socialism, What It Is. Benjamin R. Tucker, 1884. "Do you like the word socialism?" said a lady to me the other day. "I fear I do not. Somehow I shrink when I hear it. It is associated with so much that is bad. Ought we to keep it?" The lady who asked this question is an earnest anarchist, a firm friend of liberty, and it is almost superfluous to add, highly intelligent. Her words voice the feeling of many, but after all, it is only a feeling and will not stand the test of thought. Yes, I answered, it is a glorious word, much abused, violently distorted, stupidly misunderstood, but expressing better than any other the purpose of political and economic progress, the aim of the revolution in this century, the recognition of the great truth that liberty and equality, through the law of solidarity, will cause the welfare of each to contribute to the welfare of all. So good a word cannot be spared, must not be sacrificed, shall not be stolen. How can it be saved? Only by lifting it out of the confusion which obscures it, so that all may see it clearly and definitely, and what it fundamentally means. Some writers make socialism inclusive of all efforts to ameliorate social conditions. Proudhon is reputed to have said something of the kind. However that may be, the definition seems too broad. Etymologically, it is not unwarrantable, but derivatively the word has a more technical and definite meaning. Today, pardon the paradox, society is fundamentally antisocial. The whole so-called social fabric rests on privilege and power, and is disordered and strained in every direction by the inequalities that necessarily result therefrom. The welfare of each, instead of contributing to that of all, as it naturally should and would, almost invariably detracts from that of all. Wealth is made by legal privilege a hook with which to filch from labor's pockets. Every man who gets rich thereby makes his neighbor poor. The better off one is, the worse off the rest are. As Ruskin says, every grain of calculated increment to the rich is balanced by its mathematical equivalent of decrement to the poor. The laborer's deficit is precisely equal to the capitalist's efficit. Now, socialism wants to change all this. Socialism says that what's one man's meat must no longer be another's poison, that no man shall be able to add to his riches except by labor, that in adding to his riches by labor alone, no man makes another man poorer, that on the contrary, every man thus adding to his riches makes every other man richer, that increase and concentration of wealth through labor tend to increase, cheapen, and vary production, that every increase of capital in the hands of the laborer tends in the absence of legal monopoly to put more products, better products, cheaper products, and a greater variety of products within the reach of every man who works, and that this fact means the physical, mental, and moral perfecting of mankind and the realization of human fraternity. Is that not glorious? Shall a word that means all that be cast aside simply because some have tried to wed it with authority? By no means. The man who subscribes to that, whatever he may think of himself, whatever he may call himself, however bitterly he may attack the thing which he mistakes for socialism, is himself a socialist, and the man who subscribes to its opposite and acts upon its opposite, however benevolent he may be, however pious he may be, whatever his station in society, whatever his standing in the church, whatever his position in the state, is not a socialist, but a thief. For there are at bottom but two classes, the socialists and the thieves. Socialism, practically, is war upon usury in all its forms, the great anti-theft movement of the 19th century, and socialists are the only people to whom preachers of morality have no right or occasion to cite the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal." That commitment is socialism's flag, not only as a commandment but as a law of nature. Socialism does not order, it prophesies. It does not say, "Thou shalt not steal." It says, "When all men have liberty, thou wilt not steal." Why, then, does my lady questioner shrink when she hears the word socialism? I will tell her. Because a large number of people who see the evils of usury and are desirous of destroying them foolishly imagine they can do so by authority, and accordingly are trying to abolish privilege by centering all production and activity in the state, to the destruction of competition and its blessings, to the degradation of the individual, and to the putrefaction of society. They are well-meaning but misguided people, and their efforts are bound to prove abortive. Their influence is mischievous principally in this. that a large number of other people, who have not yet seen the evils of usury and do not know that liberty will destroy them, but nevertheless earnestly believe in liberty for liberty's sake, are led to mistake this effort to make the state the be-all and end-all of society for the whole of socialism and the only socialism, and, rightly horrified at it, to hold it up as such to the deserved scorn of mankind. But the very reasonable and just criticisms of the individuals of this stripe upon state socialism, when analyzed, are found to be directed not against the socialism, but against the state. So far, liberty is with them, but liberty insists on socialism nevertheless, on true socialism, anarchistic socialism, the prevalence on earth of liberty, equality, and solidarity. From that, my lady questioner will never shrink. Socialist ends, market means. Gary Chartier, 2009. I believe there is a way of understanding socialism that renders it compatible with a genuinely market-oriented anarchism. If socialism must mean either conventional state socialism or state socialism with ownership of the means of production vested in local microstates or some vaguely defined model of collective ownership rooted in a gift economy, then it has to be clear that socialism and market anarchism aren't compatible. But it ought to be troubling, then, that one of the founding spirits of market anarchism, Benjamin Tucker, clearly considered his variety of market anarchism to be an alternative to state socialism as a form of socialism. Words, nod to Nicholas Lash, are known by the company they keep, and I think it's worth reminding readers of the diverse company kept by socialism. I think it makes sense, therefore, to offer a definition of socialism that will make clear why Tucker, at least, clearly ought to be included. With that in mind, then, I suggest that we understand socialism negatively as any economic system marked by the abolition, 1. Of wage labor as the primary mode of economic activity, and 2. Of the dominance of society by a. the minority of people who regularly employ significant numbers of wage laborers, and b. a tiny minority of people owning large quantities of wealth and capital goods. We might understand socialism in positive terms as any economic system marked by 1. Wide dispersal of control over the means of production, 2. Worker management as the primary mode of economic activity, together with 3. The social preeminence of ordinary people as those who both operate and manage the means of production. State socialism has attempted to realize socialism through the power of the state. Not surprisingly, given everything we know about states, state socialism has proven in most respects to be a disaster. Coupled with the economic inefficiencies associated with central planning, the secret police, the barbed wire fences, and the suppression of dissent are all elements of state socialism's disastrous record. If you want to define socialism as state socialism, be my guest. Many people do so, but the history of the term makes clear that many people have not meant state control or society-wide ownership of the means of production when they have talked about socialism. Socialism as genus, state socialism as species. There is good reason to use socialism to mean, at minimum, something like opposition to 1. Bossism, that is, subordinative workplace hierarchy, and 2. Deprivation, that is, persistent exclusionary poverty, whether resulting from state capitalist depredation, private theft, disaster, accident, or other factors. Socialism in this sense is the genus, state socialism is the, much to be lamented, species. Indeed, using the socialist label provides the occasion for a clear distinction between the genus socialism and the species state socialism. Thus, it offers a convenient opportunity to expose and critique the statist assumptions many people reflexively make, assumptions that make it all too easy for political theory to take it as given the presupposition that its subject matter is the question, what should the state do? I am more sympathetic than perhaps I seem to the claims of those who object to linguistic arguments that they fear may have no real impact on anyone's political judgment. I wouldn't dismiss as silly someone who said that no market anarchist could employ socialist without creating inescapable confusion. Capitalism, seemingly in the same boat. So the first thing to say, I think, is that the same is true of capitalism. It's a word with a history, and the history is very often rather less than pretty. Consider people on the streets of a city in Latin America or Africa or Asia or Europe, chanting their opposition to neoliberalism and, yes, capitalism. I find it difficult to imagine that hordes of protesters would turn out in the streets to assail poor little old private ownership. When a great many people say that capitalism is the enemy, that's surely because, among many people around the world, capitalism has come to mean something like social dominance by the owners of capital, a state of affairs many people might find unappealing. In accordance with the kind of libertarian class analysis it's easy to find in the work of people like Murray Rothbard, John Hagel, Butler Schaeffer, and Roderick Long, Kevin Carson, author of the original C4SS article, and Stephan Kinsella's Target, to Kinsella's credit, he is not only blunt but also good-natured, maintains that this social dominance is dependent on the activity of the state. Remove the props provided by the state, he argues, and capitalism in this sense, the sense in which the term is employed pejoratively by millions of people who have no ideological investment in statism or bureaucratic tyranny, is finished. Socialist ends, market means. That doesn't mean that the market anarchist must somehow have forgotten her commitment to markets. As Kevin Carson, Brad Spangler, Charles Johnson, and others have observed, as a historical matter there clearly have been people who have argued for the abolition of state-supported privilege and who have enthusiastically favored freed markets who have worn the label socialist confidently. Tucker and Hodgkin wouldn't have agreed that socialism is synonymous with collective ownership. Rather, they would have said, various schemes for state ownership, or for collective ownership by some quasi-state entity, are ways of achieving the underlying goal of socialism, an end to bossism in the workplace, the dominance of the owners of capital in society, and to significant widespread deprivation. But, Tucker and Hodgkin would have said, these are both unjust and ineffective means of achieving this goal. Better to pursue it by freeing the market than by enhancing the power of the state. Of course, if socialism means state or parastate ownership of the means of production, there is no sense in characterizing Carson or any other market anarchist as defending clearly pro-socialist positions. On the other hand, if socialism can have a sufficiently broad meaning, one compatible with market anarchism, that it makes sense to say that Kevin or another market anarchist does defend such positions, then it is unclear why talk of socialism should be objectionable. Distinguishing market-oriented socialists from state socialists. Carson, for one, clearly supports the existence of private ownership rights, and I have seen nothing to suggest that he would disagree with the claim that market interactions have to feature non-state ownership if they are to be voluntary. He is consistently clear that there could, would, and should be alternative kinds of property regimes in a stateless society, but none of those he considers appropriate would be rooted in coercion, so I'm puzzled by the implication that he's an opponent of private ownership. None of that means that one can't point to despicable regimes, Pol Pot anyone, who've worn the socialist label proudly. But surely if the idea is to point to despicable applications of a term, one can do the same with capitalism as with socialism. Think Pinochet-era Chile. The association of capitalism with mercantilism and corporatism and the dominance of entrenched elites is hardly a creation of left libertarians and other market anarchists. It's an association that's common in the minds of many people around the world and which is thoroughly warranted by the behavior of states and of many businesses and socially powerful individuals. Beyond semantics. So in short, I'm not sure that using socialism as the label for a particular sort of market anarchist project, or of capitalism for what that project opposes, has to be seen as just an exercise in semantic game-playing. 1. Emancipatory intent. For instance, labeling a particular sort of market anarchist project socialist clearly identifies its emancipatory intent. It links that project with the opposition to bossism and deprivation that provide the real moral and emotional force of socialist appeals of all sorts. 2. Warranted opposition to capitalism. Thus, identifying one's project as socialist is a way of making clear one's opposition to capitalism as that term is understood by an enormous range of ordinary people around the world. The socialist label signals to them that a market anarchist project like Kevin's is on their side and that it is opposed to those entities they identify as their oppressors. 3. Forcing the state socialist to distinguish between her attachment to ends and her attachment to means. A final rationale. Suppose a market anarchist like Kevin points out to the state socialist, by sincerely owning the socialist label, that she or he shares the state socialist's ends while disagreeing radically with the state socialist's judgments about appropriate means to those ends. This simultaneously sincere and rhetorically effective move allows the market anarchist to challenge the state socialist to confront the reality that there is an inconsistency between the state socialist's emancipatory goals and the authoritarian means she or he professes to prefer. It sets the stage for the market anarchist to highlight the fact that purported statist responses to bossism create more and more powerful bosses, that the state is much better at causing deprivation than curing it. Thus, the market anarchist's use of socialism creates an occasion for the state socialist to ask her or himself, perhaps for the first time, am I really more attached to the means or to the end? I realize that what I intend as a rhetorical question may not, if the state socialist cares more about power than principle, elicit the intended answer. But it seems to me that for many state socialists, the recognition that the left-wing market anarchist sought socialist goals by non-statist means provides the state socialist with good reason to rethink her attachment to the state, to conclude that it was pragmatic and unnecessary, and that her genuinely principled attachment was to the cause of human emancipation. This means there's a meaningful opportunity for education to highlight the existence of a credible tradition advancing a different meaning of socialism. Libertarianism and the socialist vision. Now, it is obviously open to a critic to maintain that she has no particular concern with workplace hierarchies or with deprivation, or that they should be of no concern to the libertarian qua libertarian, since objections to them do not flow from libertarian principles. I am happy to identify as an anarchist who favors markets as well as individual autonomy, but I do not ask myself whether my appreciation for socialism in this case is something to which I am committed qua libertarian. Rather, my willingness to identify as a libertarian is licensed by a more fundamental set of moral judgments which also make socialism in the relevant sense attractive, and which help to ensure that the senses in which I am a libertarian and in which I am a socialist are consistent. At minimum, there seems to be some reason for using the label capitalism, so clearly understood to be the altar of socialism, for the kind of economic system we have now, backed up so clearly by state-granted and state-maintained privilege. But I think it's worth emphasizing that capitalism, both because of its history and because of its superficial content, seems to suggest more than merely state-supported privilege, though surely it implies at least this. It seems to suggest social dominance by the owners of capital, understood to be other than the owners of labor. Now, it happens to be the case that I agree with Kevin, Roderick, and others that this dominance is dependent in large measure on state abuses, but I don't want to simply emphasize my objection to these abuses, though I certainly do object, but also to express my opposition per se to the dominance of the owners of capital thus understood. That's why I am inclined to regard talk of socialism as important, as highlighting at minimum the trajectory toward which the market anarchist project be thought to lead, and as identifying morally important values to which my sort of market anarchist at least is committed, and which do not seem to me like good candidates for the status of particular interests if these are understood as arbitrary, even if morally licit. I am avowedly opposed to the initiation of force against persons and their justly acquired possessions. That makes me fairly unproblematically a libertarian. But that doesn't change the fact that socialism is a term that remains useful for the left libertarian project. I believe that socialism names a set of concerns related to resolution of what in the 19th century would have been called the social question that there is good reason for left libertarians wholeheartedly to endorse.